If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Edwin Holbrook, but most people just call me Ed. I'm 37 years old, and for the past few years I've been running from things I'd rather not talk about. Memories, nightmares, stuff that keeps me up at night. I figured isolation would be the answer, so when the Park Service offered me a job as a fire lookout on Echo Mountain, I didn't think twice. The job was simple enough. Sit in a tower all summer, scan the forest for smoke, and report anything unusual over the radio. The tower was 80 feet tall, perched on top of Echo Mountain in the Cascade Range of Washington State. It was surrounded by endless old-growth trees and jagged peaks, beautiful but lonely. The nearest town was 30 miles away down winding roads that felt like they could collapse any second. When I arrived, the place felt off. The drought had left everything bone dry, and the fire danger was at its highest level. The air smelled faintly of smoke from distant fires, and sometimes it drifted through the valleys like a warning. Even the animals seemed uneasy. Birds were quiet, and the occasional rustle in the bushes made me jump more than it should have. The lookout tower itself was sturdy but worn down. Inside was a bed, a small stove, some shelves full of canned food, and a desk with a radio. There was also a logbook left by the previous lookout, a guy named Harrison who'd worked here last season. His entries started normal enough. Weather updates, wildlife sightings, notes about hikers passing through, but as I flipped through the pages, his writing got strange. Voices in the wind, one entry said. Another read, "Something's watching me from the ridge." His last entry stopped mid-sentence. "I can't take it anymore." I closed the book and shoved it into a drawer. Cabin fever, I told myself. That's all it was. Being alone for months can mess with your head, if you're not used to it. But I wasn't worried. I'd spent years in the wilderness as an Army Ranger after Korea. Solitude didn't scare me. I thought I could handle anything this mountain threw at me. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into my routine, scanning for smoke with binoculars, jotting down weather readings in my journal, sketching wildlife when I had time to kill. Every evening I checked in with headquarters over the radio to confirm everything was fine. But even then, little things started to feel wrong. Sometimes there'd be static on the radio when there shouldn't be, like someone else was trying to talk but couldn't quite get through. Once or twice, my own voice echoed back at me during check-ins, even though I hadn't said anything yet. One afternoon, while hiking near the tower, I spotted a bull elk standing perfectly still in a clearing, below me. It wasn't grazing or moving, just staring straight at me like it knew something I didn't. It stayed there for hours before finally disappearing into the trees without making a sound. I told myself it was nothing. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, something about Echo Mountain felt different from anywhere else I'd been before. I woke up early one morning to the sound of the wind rattling the windows. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I grabbed my binoculars and stepped out onto the tower's platform to scan for smoke, but everything looked clear. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows over the trees below. That's when I noticed something strange near the base of the tower. Tracks. At first, I thought they might belong to a bear, or maybe a cougar, but as I climbed down, to get a closer look, I realized they weren't like any tracks I'd ever seen before. They were almost human, barefoot, but the toes were way too long, and the stride was uneven, like whoever, or whatever, made them wasn't walking right. I followed the tracks for a while, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I told myself it was probably just some animal I hadn't seen before. The Cascades are full of surprises, right? But still, something about those tracks stuck with me. Later that day, I got a call on the radio from headquarters. 2 hikers had gone missing, on the North Ridge about 5 miles from my tower. They wanted me to keep an eye out for any signs of them. Campfires, movement, anything unusual. I spent hours scanning the ridge with my binoculars but didn't see a thing. As the sun started to set, clouds rolled in and thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming. That night, as lightning lit up the sky, I saw something on the ridge. A tall figure standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. It was too far away to make out any details, but it didn't move at all, not even when the wind picked up or when branches snapped around it. I stared at it for what felt like forever before another flash of lightning lit up the ridge again, and it was gone. The next morning, I couldn't shake what I'd seen. I told myself it was probably just a tree or a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. A few days later, something happened that really shook me. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk writing in my journal when everything went quiet, completely silent. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, not even the sound of wind in the trees. Just nothing. I stepped outside and looked around, but there was no sign of anything unusual, just that eerie silence pressing down on me like a weight. It lasted for exactly 37 minutes before everything went back to normal all at once. The birds started singing again, and the wind picked up like nothing had happened. That night, during my radio check-in with headquarters, there was another glitch. In the transmission, static followed by what sounded like fragments of someone else's voice cutting in and out over mine. It wasn't clear enough to make out what they were saying, but it sent chills down my spine. I tried to focus on my duties and ignore all these little things piling up around me. The tracks, the figure on the ridge, the silence. But it was getting harder and harder to convince myself that everything was fine. A week had passed since the silence in the forest, but things were only getting stranger. I was trying to keep my head down, stick to my routine, and focus on my job, but the mountain wasn't making it easy for me. Rick, the supply pilot, showed up one morning with my monthly delivery: canned food, water, and a few letters from headquarters. Normally, Rick was a chatty guy who'd crack jokes and complain about the flight up here, but this time, something was off. He barely said a word as he unloaded the supplies, and when he did speak, it didn't sound like him. His sentences were short and weirdly disjointed, like he was trying to remember how to talk. At one point, he looked at me and said, "The forest listens. You know that, right?" I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and walked off toward his tent without another word. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something about Rick's behavior had me on edge. The next morning, I went to check on him, but his tent was empty. The flap was open, and his gear was still inside. His sleeping bag, flashlight, everything. But there were bloody footprints leading away from the tent into the woods. They were barefoot and looked just like the tracks I'd found near the tower earlier that week. I called headquarters on the radio to report Rick missing, but all I got back was static. That afternoon, I found something else. Something worse. While walking around the base of the tower, I noticed a strange pattern on the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was a circle of dead animals. Birds, squirrels, even a deer, all arranged in perfect concentric rings. Their bodies were intact except for one thing. Their throats had been cut cleanly, and their vocal cords were gone. I stumbled back in horror and ran up to the tower to grab my binoculars. I scanned the forest frantically but saw nothing unusual, just trees swaying in the wind like they always did. That night was when things really started to unravel. I was lying in bed when I heard it, my ex-wife's voice calling my name from outside the tower. Ed. Ed. Please help me. It sounded exactly like her, soft and desperate, but there was no way it could be real. She wasn't here. She hadn't been part of my life for years. Still, hearing her voice made my chest tighten. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the tower. "Where are you?" I called out into the dark. Her voice came again. "Over here. Please hurry." I followed the sound into the trees until I reached a small clearing, and stopped dead in my tracks. There was no one there, just a pile of human teeth sitting in the dirt. I turned around and sprinted back to the tower as fast as I could. The next day, during my radio check-in with Catherine, the wildlife biologist who sometimes called in, her voice sounded strange too. It was distorted like it was being played through an old tape recorder. And then, halfway through our conversation, her voice cut out completely and was replaced by mine, repeating something I'd said days ago. Everything's fine up here, but it wasn't fine, not even close. That night when I went to lock, up for bed, I noticed something carved into the wooden door of the tower, symbols that looked ancient and jagged like warnings scratched into stone by someone desperate to be heard. The next morning, Thomas Reed, the senior park ranger, called me on the radio. His voice sounded shaky as he told me about an old legend passed down by locals, a creature they called the Stealer of Voices. He said it could mimic anything it heard and used those voices to lure people into traps. Be careful, Thomas warned me before signing off. It feeds on fear. I barely slept after hearing Thomas's warning about the Stealer of Voices. His words kept echoing in my head. It feeds on fear. I didn't want to believe it, but everything I'd seen, everything I'd heard, was starting to make sense. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and it was getting closer. The next morning, I decided to search for Rick. I couldn't just sit in the tower and wait for something to happen. I packed my hunting knife, a flashlight, and some water, then set out toward the ridge where I'd last seen him. About 5 miles from the tower, I found Rick's plane, or what was left of it. The cockpit was smashed into a tree, and the supplies he'd been carrying were scattered everywhere. But Rick wasn't there. Instead, sitting on the pilot's seat was something that made my stomach turn. His larynx, his voice box, neatly placed like some kind of sick trophy. I stumbled back, gagging, and ran into the forest without looking back. My mind was racing. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just hunting, it was collecting voices. When I got back to the tower, I found Thomas waiting for me at the base. He looked pale and exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. "I came to check on you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong out here." I told him about Rick's plane and the larynx, and his face went even paler. He didn't say much after that, just nodded and muttered something about the old stories being true. Later that evening, while Thomas was collecting water from a nearby stream, I heard him scream. By the time I got there, it was too late. He was lying on the ground with his throat torn open, but somehow he was still whispering. His lips weren't moving, but his voice, his real voice, was coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Run." "Ed." I froze, staring at him as his voice grew fainter and fainter until it stopped completely. Then everything went silent again. The same unnatural silence I'd felt before. I dragged Thomas's body back to the tower and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking as I wrote everything down in my journal, trying to make sense of it all. That night, the creature came closer. Than ever before, it didn't try to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. It started calling to me using every voice it had stolen. Rick's calm drawl, Catherine's cheerful tone, Thomas's gruff warnings, even my own voice from when I was a kid. "Ed, come outside. We need your help. You can't hide forever." The voices surrounded the tower like a storm, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. I shoved my hands over my ears and screamed at it to stop, but that only seemed to make it worse. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay in the tower anymore. It wasn't safe, not for me or anyone else who might come up here looking for help. I spent the next day coming up with a plan. If this thing could mimic voices, then maybe it relied on sound to hunt its prey. Maybe I could use that against it. I dug through my supplies and found an old tape recorder along with some spare batteries. Over the next few hours, I recorded myself speaking. Simple things like, "over here," and "come get me." then played them back over and over until they sounded natural. That night, under cover of darkness, I snuck out of the tower and set up the recorder in a clearing about half a mile away. Then I waited. Sure enough, just after midnight I heard it moving through the forest toward the sound of my voice on the recorder. Its footsteps were slow and deliberate, like it knew exactly where it was going. I followed it from a distance, staying as quiet as possible. Every time it reached one of my recordings, I'd trigger another one farther away to lure it deeper into the woods. By dawn, I'd tracked it to a cave system hidden beneath a rocky outcrop near the ridge. The entrance was narrow and dark, but inside was something out of a nightmare. The walls were lined with thousands of preserved vocal cords strung up like wind chimes. Some fresh and pink, others dried out and brittle with age. They swayed gently in the stale air as if they were alive. In the center of the cave stood the creature itself, a tall, ash-gray figure with elongated limbs and pitch-black eyes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. It shifted its shape constantly as if trying on different forms. First Rick's face, then Thomas's, then mine. It didn't notice me at first. It was too busy running its long fingers over its collection of stolen voices like they were treasures. My heart pounded as I pulled out my lighter and set fire to one of the strings of vocal cords hanging near me. The flames spread quickly through the cave, filling it with thick black smoke that made my eyes water and my lungs burn. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream, a horrifying mix of every voice it had ever stolen, as its collection burned away. The cave was chaos. Smoke filled the air, curling around the creature like a living thing. The fire spread quickly, consuming the strings of vocal cords that hung from the walls. Each time one burned, the creature let out a new scream, a horrifying mix of voices that didn't belong together. I crouched behind a rock, my hand gripping my father's old hunting knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The creature was thrashing now, its long limbs jerking wildly as it tried to save its collection. But it wasn't just angry, it was scared. For a moment, I thought I might actually have the upper hand. Then its head snapped toward me, and those black, empty eyes locked onto mine. It moved fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. 1 second it was across the cave, and the next it was right in front of me, towering over me like a shadow come to life. Its shape kept shifting. Rick's face, Thomas's face, even my own face. But its eyes stayed the same, cold and bottomless. I slashed at it with the knife, but it barely flinched. Its limbs wrapped around me like vines, pinning my arms to my sides. Its skin felt cold and rough like tree bark soaked in ice water. Then it spoke, or rather, they spoke. Every voice it had ever stolen poured out of its mouth all at once, overlapping and echoing in a way that made my head feel like it was splitting open. Why do you burn us? The voices weren't angry. They were pleading. It was like they were begging me to stop, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just another one of its tricks. I gritted my teeth and shoved against it with everything I had, managing to free one arm just long enough to grab a burning stick from the ground. I swung it at the creature's face, and for the first time, it recoiled, its skin blistering where the flames touched it. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed another burning stick and started swinging wildly, forcing it back toward the center of the cave where the fire was strongest. The smoke was getting thicker now, choking me as I stumbled toward the exit. My vision blurred, but I could still hear the creature's screams behind me, louder and more desperate with every step I took. As I reached the mouth of the cave, I turned back one last time and saw it standing in the middle of the flames. Its body was melting away like wax under a blowtorch, but its eyes stayed locked on mine until they finally disappeared into the smoke. I staggered out into the fresh air just as the first rays of sunlight broke over the ridge. My lungs burned with every breath, and my legs felt like they might give out at any second, but I kept moving. The fire I'd started in the cave had spread to the forest around me. I could see flames licking at the trees in every direction. The lookout tower was gone now. I could see smoke rising from where it used to stand. I didn't stop until I reached an old dirt road at the base of the mountain. A search and rescue team found me there 2 days later, dehydrated, covered in burns and scratches, and barely able to speak above a whisper. 6 months later, I'm working at an urban ranger station far from Echo Mountain. No more backcountry assignments for me. I don't think I could handle being alone out there again. I still think about what happened up on that mountain every day. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will believe me if I ever tell them the truth about what I saw, about what it was, but most days I just try not to think about it too much. There's one thing I do every morning now. I record myself speaking into a tape recorder, just a few sentences, and then play it back to make sure my voice still sounds like mine. Last night, something strange happened. The phone rang in the station after hours when no one else was around. When I picked it up, there was no one on the other end, just silence. And then, my own voice came through, soft and distant like it had been recorded months ago. Everything's fine up here. My name is Dr. Marcus Winters, and I've spent most of my life studying glaciers and the secrets they hold. I'm not a thrill seeker or a believer in ghost stories, but what happened to me last winter at Outpost Wolverine changed everything. I thought I knew about the world, and myself. If you're listening to this, I need you to believe me, no matter how strange it sounds, because what I saw out there, it wasn't human. It all started when I got a call from the U.S. Geological Survey. They needed someone to investigate unusual melting patterns in Denali National Park, Alaska. The glaciers were thawing faster than ever, exposing layers of ice that hadn't seen sunlight in thousands of years. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for someone like me, a glaciologist who spent more time with ice cores than people. But there was something odd about this assignment right from the start. The ranger station where I was supposed to stay, Outpost Wolverine, had been abandoned for months. The last ranger stationed there had left abruptly, citing personal reasons. No one seemed to know, or wanted to say, what those reasons were. I arrived at the park on a cold, gray afternoon. The air smelled sharp and metallic, like a storm was brewing. A young park ranger named Gabriel picked me up from the small airstrip in his beat-up snowmobile. He was friendly enough, but there was something about his eyes, like he was hiding something. Outpost Wolverine's seen better days, Gabriel said as we rode through the dense forest. It's remote, even by Alaskan standards. You'll have plenty of peace and quiet for your research. Peace and quiet is all I need, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The outpost came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a squat wooden cabin, surrounded by towering pines and endless snowfields. The place looked sturdy enough, but there was an eerie stillness about it, like it had been forgotten by time. Gabriel helped me unload my gear and showed me around. The cabin had all the basics: a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen, a bunk room, with creaky beds and a radio for emergencies. There was no Wi-Fi or cell service, not surprising this far north, but I didn't mind. I'd come here to work, not scroll through social media. As Gabriel prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Listen," he said quietly. "If you hear anything strange out here, howling or other noises, just stay inside and lock the doors." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. "Wolves?" I asked. "Sure," he said quickly, but his tone didn't match his words. "Just be careful." And with that, he left me alone in the middle of nowhere. That first night was uneventful but unsettling. The wind howled through the trees like a living thing, and every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Still, I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I'd spent years working in remote locations without any problems. The next morning, I started my work right away. My job was to collect ice samples from the nearby glacier and analyze them for signs of ancient life. Bacteria, pollen, anything that could tell us about Earth's past climates. It was fascinating work, but as I trekked across the frozen landscape with my equipment in tow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, but then I started noticing things. Small things that didn't make sense. Tracks in the snow that didn't match any animal I knew of. Strange patterns etched into the ice, like claw marks or symbols carved by an unseen hand. One afternoon, while taking samples near a deep crevasse in the glacier, I found something that stopped me cold. A perfectly preserved bird, frozen in the ice. It wasn't unusual to find ancient creatures trapped in glaciers. That's part of what makes them so fascinating. But this bird looked wrong, somehow. Its feathers were pristine, as if it had died yesterday, but its eyes were wide open and filled with terror. I took photos and carefully extracted it from the ice to examine back at the cabin. That night, as I studied it under my microscope, Gabriel stopped by unexpectedly. "Find anything interesting?" he asked casually. I showed him the bird and explained how strange it was that something so well preserved could appear so suddenly after thousands of years buried in ice. Gabriel's face darkened as he stared at it. "You should put that back where you found it," he said firmly. "Why?" I asked, confused. "It's just better that way," he muttered before leaving abruptly. His reaction unsettled me more than anything else so far. What did he know? That he wasn't telling me? And why did he seem so afraid? That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling beams above me, sleep wouldn't come easily. Not with Gabriel's warning echoing in my mind, or with that bird's lifeless eyes burned into my memory. Little did I know then. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The cabin was colder than usual, even though the wood stove had been burning all night. I wrapped myself in a thick jacket and stepped outside to check the weather. The sky was clear, but the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I decided to head back to the glacier to continue my work. Gabriel had mentioned he'd be patrolling nearby, so I figured I might run into him later. As I walked through the snow-covered forest, everything seemed quieter than it should have been. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional gust of wind. When I reached the glacier, I noticed something strange right away. There were fresh tracks leading toward the crevasse where I'd found the frozen bird. But these weren't human tracks or animal tracks. They were long and thin, almost like scratches in the snow. They seemed to start out of nowhere and disappeared into the ice. I followed them cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The tracks led me to a spot near the edge of the crevasse where the ice was thinner than usual. As I knelt down to examine it, I saw something glinting beneath the surface, a shard of black stone that looked completely out of place. Using my ice pick, I carefully chipped away at the surrounding ice until I could free it. The stone was smooth and cold to the touch, but it didn't look natural. It felt like it had been shaped by someone, or something. I slipped it into my backpack and decided to head back to the cabin to study it further. On my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often, I'd hear faint crunching sounds behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. When I finally reached Outpost Wolverine, Gabriel was waiting for me outside. He looked pale and nervous. "You shouldn't be out there alone," he said sharply. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice sounded less confident than I'd hoped. Gabriel stared at me for a moment before sighing. "There's something you need to know about this place," he said quietly. "Something people don't talk about." I raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything, letting him continue. "There's an old legend around here," he began hesitantly. "The locals call them cold spirits. They say they live in the glaciers, trapped in the ice, and when the ice melts, they wake up." I couldn't help but laugh nervously. "Sounds like a campfire story," I said. Gabriel didn't smile. "Maybe," he said stiffly, "but people have gone missing out here, hikers, rangers, and no one ever finds them." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off as superstition. "I'm here for science," I said firmly, "not ghost stories." Gabriel nodded, but didn't look convinced. Before he left, he added one last warning. "If you hear anything strange tonight, don't go outside." That evening, as I studied the black stone under a magnifying glass, I noticed something unusual about its surface. It was covered in tiny grooves that formed intricate patterns. They looked almost like writing or symbols, but they didn't match any language or markings I'd seen before. As I worked late into the night, trying to make sense of what I'd found, strange things started happening around the cabin. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the windows and shaking loose snow from the roof. The radio crackled with static even though it wasn't turned on. And then there was a sound outside. It started faintly, a low humming noise that seemed to come from deep within the forest. At first, I thought it might be Gabriel's snowmobile returning unexpectedly, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't mechanical at all. It sounded alive, like breathing mixed with growling. I froze in place, listening intently as my pulse quickened. The sound circled the cabin slowly before fading into silence again. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, maybe a wolf, but deep down, I knew better. That night, when I finally climbed into bed, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin felt amplified in the darkness. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps approaching my door. And then, just as my eyes began to close, there was a knock at the window. It wasn't loud, just a soft tap, 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 but it sent chills down my spine nonetheless. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the window slowly, trying not to make any noise. When I reached it and shined my light outside, there was nothing there except snow and shadows. But just as I turned away from the window, something knocked again, this time from the other side of the cabin. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside the cabin felt like a threat. Every shadow seemed alive. By morning, I was exhausted, but I told myself I couldn't let fear get the better of me. I had work to do, and answers to find. Gabriel stopped by early, looking as uneasy as ever. "You okay?" he asked, noticing the dark circles under my eyes. "Yeah," I lied. "Just a long night." He didn't press me for details, but his expression told me he knew something wasn't right. "I'll be out patrolling near the glacier today," he said. "If you need anything, call me on the radio." I nodded and watched him leave, feeling strangely relieved to know he'd be close by. I spent most of the day analyzing the black stone and reviewing my notes from the glacier. The patterns on the stone still didn't make sense to me, but they seemed deliberate, like someone or something had carved them with purpose. The more I stared at them, the more uneasy I felt, as if they were trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. Around midday, Diane showed up at the cabin. She was a wildlife photographer who'd been working in the area for weeks, documenting the effects of climate change on local ecosystems. Gabriel had mentioned her before, but this was my first time meeting her in person. "You must be Marcus," she said with a friendly smile. "Gabriel told me you're studying the glacier." "That's right," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. She pulled out her camera and showed me some of her recent photos. Wolves avoiding certain areas near the glacier, strange formations in the ice that looked almost like faces. "I thought you might find these interesting," she said. I studied the images carefully, my heart racing as I recognized some of the patterns from the black stone. "Where did you take these?" I asked. "Near the crevasse," she said casually. "Same place Gabriel said you've been working." I hesitated before asking my next question. "Have you noticed anything strange out there? Sounds? Tracks?" Diane frowned slightly but nodded. Yeah, actually, she said. The wolves have been acting weird, staying away from certain areas like they're scared of something. And last night, I thought I saw something moving inside the glacier. What kind of something? I asked quickly. She shrugged but looked uneasy. I don't know. It was dark and far away, but it didn't look like an animal. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Whatever was happening out there wasn't just in my head. It was real. That evening, Gabriel came by again to check on me. Diane had already left to set up her camera traps near the forest edge, so it was just him and me in the cabin. I need to ask you something, I said as he warmed his hands by the stove. Go ahead, he replied cautiously. What happened to the last ranger stationed here? I asked bluntly. Gabriel stiffened and avoided my gaze. He left, he said simply. Why? I pressed. Gabriel sighed heavily and sat down across from me. He started seeing things, he admitted reluctantly. Hearing voices in the wind, feeling like he was being watched all the time. And no one thought that was worth mentioning before sending me here? I asked angrily. It's not exactly something we put in job descriptions, Gabriel muttered. Besides, most people think it's just isolation getting to you. But you don't think that, I said firmly. Gabriel hesitated before answering. No, he admitted quietly. I've seen things too, things I can't explain. Before, I could ask him more questions. There was a loud bang outside, a sound like metal hitting metal. Gabriel grabbed his flashlight and motioned for me to stay inside while he checked it out. I waited anxiously by the window as he disappeared into the darkness. Minutes passed without any sign of him, and then there was another sound, a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I grabbed my own flashlight and stepped outside despite Gabriel's earlier warnings not to leave the cabin at night. The cold hit me like a wall as I scanned the area for any sign of him. Gabriel! I called out into the darkness. No response. And then I saw it. Near the edge of the forest where Diane had set up her camera traps earlier, there was movement. Something, tall and pale, slipping between the trees like smoke. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal, it was something else entirely. I froze in place as it turned toward me briefly before disappearing into the shadows again. Its face, or what passed for one, was featureless except for two glowing blue eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back toward the cabin and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to light a fire in the stove again. Gabriel returned about an hour later, looking pale but unharmed. He didn't say much about what he'd seen outside, just muttered something about checking on Diane tomorrow morning. But his silence spoke volumes. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Gabriel and I decided to check on Diane. Neither of us had slept much, but we knew we couldn't ignore what was happening. Gabriel packed his rifle, even though he didn't say why, and I grabbed my gear, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange events. The forest felt different as we walked through it. Quieter than usual, almost like it was holding its breath. The snow crunched beneath our boots, but the sound seemed muffled, swallowed by the stillness around us. When we reached Diane's campsite near the edge of the glacier, her tent was empty. Her camera traps were still set up, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Gabriel called out her name several times, his voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Maybe she went back to the cabin, I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Gabriel shook his head. Her snowmobile's still here, he said grimly. We decided to check her camera traps for clues. Gabriel handed me one of the memory cards while he reviewed another on his tablet. As I scrolled through the images on my laptop, my stomach tightened. Most of the photos were normal. Wolves passing through the area, snow falling. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In one of the photos, taken just before dawn, there was a figure standing near the glacier. It was tall and pale, with glowing blue eyes that seemed to burn through the screen. Its body looked almost human but stretched unnaturally long, like it had been pulled apart and pieced back together wrong. "Gabriel," I said shakily, turning, my laptop toward him. He stared at the image for a long moment before muttering under his breath, "Cold spirits." I wanted to dismiss it as a trick of light or a glitch in the camera, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. As we continued searching for Diane, things only got stranger. We found her footprints, leading toward the glacier, but stopped abruptly near a crevasse where the ice was cracked and uneven. There were no signs of struggle, no blood or torn clothing, just footprints that ended as if she'd vanished into thin air. Gabriel crouched near the edge of the crevasse and shined his flashlight inside. "There's something down there," he said quietly. I leaned over cautiously and peered into the darkness below. At first, all I could see was ice, smooth and glistening. But then I noticed movement. Something was shifting beneath the surface. Slowly at first, but growing faster as we watched. "Get back," Gabriel said sharply, pulling me away from the edge. Before I could argue, there was a loud cracking sound as part of the glacier collapsed inward. The ground shook violently beneath our feet as chunks of ice tumbled into the crevasse below, and then it emerged. The creature from Diane's photo crawled out of the glacier like a spider escaping its web. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. It didn't make a sound, just stared at us with those piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow brighter in the daylight. Gabriel raised his rifle instinctively and fired a shot into its chest. The bullet hit its mark but didn't seem to faze. It just kept coming toward us slowly but deliberately. "Run!" Gabriel shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the crevasse. We sprinted through the forest as fast as we could, dodging trees and slipping on patches of ice. The creature followed us relentlessly, its movements eerily silent despite its size. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it was closer, its glowing eyes cutting through the shadows like headlights. When we finally reached Outpost Wolverine, Gabriel slammed the door shut behind us and bolted it tightly. "That thing's not human," he said breathlessly. "No kidding," I replied, trying to catch my breath. We sat in silence for a while, listening for any signs that it had followed us to the cabin. The wind howled outside like a warning, but there were no knocks or growls this time, just an eerie stillness that felt even worse than noise. "What do we do now?" I asked finally. Gabriel didn't answer right away, just stared out the window with a grim expression. "We survive," he said simply. "That night was one of the longest of my life. Every shadow outside felt like it could be hiding something. Every creak of the cabin made me jump." Gabriel stayed awake by the window with his rifle in hand while I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. The black stone from earlier still sat on my desk where I'd left it. As I studied its patterns again under my magnifying glass, something clicked in my mind. A connection I hadn't noticed before. Symbols weren't random, they were warnings. The cabin felt like a cage. Gabriel and I stayed inside, listening for any signs of the creature outside. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. Every so often, Gabriel would glance out the window with his rifle ready, but there was nothing to see. Just snow and shadows. I couldn't sit still. My mind kept going back to the black stone and the symbols carved into it. They weren't random. They were warnings. The patterns reminded me of ancient markings I'd seen in research papers about early human civilizations. They were meant to ward off something dangerous. "Gabriel," I said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I think this stone is connected to whatever's out there." He looked at me skeptically but didn't dismiss it outright. "What? Do you mean?" I explained how the symbols seemed deliberate, like they were trying to keep something trapped, or warn people to stay away. "What if the glacier melting is what woke it up?" I asked. Gabriel didn't respond right away. He just stared at the stone with a grim expression. "If that's true," he said finally, "then we're in more trouble than we thought." Before we could discuss it further, there was a loud thud outside. It wasn't a knock or a growl. It was heavier, like something hitting the ground hard. Gabriel jumped to his feet and aimed his rifle at the door. "Stay back," he warned me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood behind him, my heart pounding in my chest. The thud came again, closer this time, followed by a strange scraping sound, like claws dragging across wood. Gabriel motioned for me to stay quiet as he crept toward the window and peeked outside. His face went pale instantly. "What is it?" I whispered. "It's here," he said grimly. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. The creature had found us. The scraping grew louder as it circled the cabin slowly, its movements deliberate and methodical. Every so often, it would stop near a window or door, as if testing our defenses. Gabriel tightened his grip on the rifle but didn't fire. He knew it wouldn't do much good. "We can't stay here," I said urgently. Gabriel nodded reluctantly. "There's an old geothermal spring about 2 miles from here," he said, quietly. "The water's hot enough to keep the ice from forming. It might be enough to slow it down." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than waiting for the creature to break in. We packed quickly, grabbing only what we needed: food, water, flashlights, and Gabriel's rifle. As we prepared to leave, I slipped the black stone into my backpack. It felt important somehow, even if I didn't fully understand why. We waited for a lull in the creature's movements before making our escape. Gabriel opened the door cautiously and scanned the area with his flashlight before motioning for me to follow him. The cold hit me like a wall as we stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath our boots loudly in the silence, making it impossible to move quietly. We headed toward the geothermal spring as quickly as we could without drawing attention to ourselves. But we weren't fast enough. Halfway through the forest, I heard it. The low growl that had haunted me since my first night at Outpost Wolverine. It was closer now, louder and more menacing than ever before. "Run!" Gabriel shouted, firing a shot behind us as we sprinted through the trees. The creature moved faster than I'd expected, its long limbs carrying it effortlessly over the snow-covered ground. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, it was closer. Those glowing blue eyes cutting through the darkness like flames. We reached the geothermal spring just as Gabriel ran out of ammunition. The hot water bubbled and steamed in stark contrast to the freezing air around us, a small oasis of warmth in an otherwise icy landscape. "Get in," Gabriel shouted as he grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the edge of the spring. We waded into the water cautiously but quickly, letting its warmth surround us as we watched for any sign of movement outside its perimeter. The creature stopped at the edge of the spring and stared at us with those piercing blue eyes. It seemed hesitant for the first time since we'd encountered it. "It doesn't like heat," I realized aloud. Gabriel nodded, but didn't take his eyes off the creature. "It's been living in ice for who knows how long. Heat probably feels like poison to it." The creature paced around the edge of the spring slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if trying to decide whether or not to attack us directly. For a moment I thought we might have found safety, but then it did something unexpected. It reached into its chest with one of its long claws and pulled out a shard of black stone, identical to the one I'd found earlier, and threw it into the water near us. The water hissed violently as steam rose around us thickly. Suddenly, I felt dizzy and disoriented, as if gravity itself had shifted somehow, and realized too late that this wasn't just an ordinary rock. It carried some kind of energy that disrupted reality itself. The moment the black stone hit the water, everything changed. The steam around us thickened, swirling like smoke, and the air became heavy, almost suffocating. My head spun as the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like the earth itself was twisting out of place. Gabriel grabbed my arm to steady me, his face pale and tense. "What's happening?" I gasped. "I don't know," he said, his voice tight with fear. "But we need to move. Now." The creature stood at the edge of the spring, watching us with those glowing blue eyes. It didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It seemed to be waiting, testing us somehow. The shard it had thrown into the water was still there, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. I reached into my backpack and pulled out the black stone I'd found earlier. The patterns on its surface seemed to glow faintly in response to the shard in the water. It was like they were connected. Two pieces of something much larger. Gabriel noticed it immediately. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. "I think this is the key," I said, holding up the stone. "It's connected to that thing somehow." "Connected how?" he asked, his voice rising in panic. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's worth a shot." Before he could stop me, I waded deeper into the spring, holding the stone tightly in my hand. The heat of the water burned against my skin, but I ignored it and focused on the creature. Its eyes followed me closely as I approached the shard. It had thrown into the water. "Marcus!" Gabriel shouted behind me. "Get back here!" I didn't listen. Something inside me told me this was the only way to end it, to stop whatever was happening before it got worse. As I reached the shard, I held up my stone and pressed it against its surface. The moment they touched, a blinding light erupted from both stones, illuminating everything around us in stark white. The creature let out a piercing shriek, a sound so loud and unnatural that it felt like it was tearing through my chest. The light grew brighter and hotter until I couldn't see or feel anything except its overwhelming presence. And then, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes again, the creature was gone. The shard in the water had vanished along with it, leaving only ripples in its place. Gabriel was kneeling at the edge of the spring, staring at me in shock. "What just happened?" he asked breathlessly. I began slowly, struggling to find the right words. "I think we sent it back." "Back where?" Gabriel asked. I shook my head. "I don't know." We climbed out of the spring cautiously and looked around for any signs of danger. The forest was still eerily quiet, but there was no sign of the creature or its glowing blue eyes anywhere. Gabriel turned to me with a serious expression. "We need to leave," he said firmly. "Now." I nodded in agreement. Whatever had just happened wasn't over. Not really. But staying here wasn't an option anymore. As we made our way back to Outpost Wolverine to pack up our things, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. That whatever we'd encountered wasn't gone for good. When we reached the cabin, Gabriel handed me a cup of hot coffee and sat down across from me at the table. "What do you think it was?" he asked quietly. I stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Something ancient," I said finally. "Something that doesn't belong here." Gabriel nodded slowly but didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. We both knew what we'd seen would haunt us forever. As we left Denali National Park later that day, I couldn't help but glance back at the glacier one last time. It looked peaceful now, just another frozen landscape. But I knew better than to trust appearances, because somewhere out there, buried deep within the ice, something was waiting. My name is Alex Carter, and I'm a journalist. Not the kind that chases celebrities or writes about politics. I dig into mysteries, uncover hidden stories, and sometimes I even chase ghosts. Well, not literally ghosts. I don't believe in them. At least, I didn't until I visited that cursed mansion in the middle of nowhere. It all started when my editor handed me a file about an old abandoned mansion in a remote village. The place was called Blackwood Manor, and it had a reputation for being haunted. People said strange things happened there, lights flickering inside even though there's no electricity, screams echoing at night, and anyone who dared to go inside never came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. I didn't believe any of it. Ghost stories are usually just that, stories. But the villagers were terrified of the place, and their fear made me curious. If I could write an article exposing the truth behind Blackwood Manor, it would be big news. So I packed my bag with a flashlight, a notebook, and my trusty camera, and drove out to the village to see it for myself. The village was small, just a few houses scattered along a dirt road surrounded by thick woods. As soon as I arrived, people stared at me like I didn't belong there. An old man sitting outside a grocery store stopped me before I could even ask for directions. "You're not here for Blackwood Manor, are you?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded. "I'm just here to look around. Don't go near it," he warned. "That place is cursed. It's not safe." I tried to ask him more about what he meant, but he wouldn't say anything else. Others in the village were just as tight-lipped. They avoided eye contact and hurried away whenever I mentioned the mansion. This only made me more determined to find out what was going on. If people were this scared of a crumbling old house, there had to be something worth investigating. By late afternoon, I stood at the edge of the forest path leading to Blackwood Manor. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches forming shadows that stretched across the ground like claws. The air felt colder here, even though it was summer. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the path. The path leading to Blackwood Manor was quiet. Too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no rustling, leaves, just the sound of my footsteps crunching on the dirt. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After walking for about 10 minutes, I saw it, the mansion. It stood at the end of the path like a giant shadow, its tall windows staring back at me like empty eyes. The roof was caved in on one side, and ivy had taken over most of the walls. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I stopped for a moment and stared at it. I wasn't scared. I don't scare easily. But there was something about the place that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the trees seemed to lean toward the house as if they were trying to keep it hidden. I shook off the feeling and walked closer. The front door was heavy and wooden, with deep scratches carved into it. They looked like claw marks, but I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a bear or something. I pushed the door open, and it creaked, loudly, echoing through the empty halls. The air inside smelled damp and old, like wet wood and rotting fabric. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing dusty furniture covered in white sheets. The living room had a grand fireplace with a cracked stone mantel, and above it hung a faded portrait of a family. A man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were blurred from age, but their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. I took out my camera and snapped a few pictures. As I did, I thought I heard something. A faint whisper. It was so soft that I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the massive house. No answer. I kept exploring, moving deeper, into the mansion. The floors creaked under my weight, and every now and then I'd hear strange noises, like footsteps or distant laughter. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. In one room, I found an old piano covered in dust. Its keys were yellowed with age, but one of them looked clean, as if someone had touched it recently. That's when I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dust on the floor. They weren't mine. They were smaller, like a child's. Followed them down a long hallway until they stopped at a door at the end. This door was different from the others. It had deep scratches on it too, but these were more chaotic, like someone had been clawing at it from inside. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door and wondering what could be behind it. That's when I heard another sound, a soft tapping coming from somewhere upstairs. My heart started beating faster as I turned toward the staircase. The tapping continued, steady and slow, like someone knocking on wood. I didn't want to go upstairs. I really didn't, but my curiosity got the better of me. Holding my flashlight tight, I started climbing the stairs one creaky step at a time. The stairs groaned under my feet as I climbed, each step sounding louder than the last. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I stopped to tap it back into working order. The tapping sound upstairs hadn't stopped. It was steady, like someone knocking on a door or maybe tapping their fingers on a table. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself in another long hallway. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that looked like it had once been bright and cheerful but was now peeling and stained. There were more doors here, each one closed. The tapping was coming from the last room on the left. I walked slowly toward it, my flashlight beam shaking slightly in my hand. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. By the time I reached the door, my breath was visible in front of me like it was winter inside this one room. I knocked softly on the door. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, revealing a small bedroom with a single bed pushed against the far wall. The bed was covered in a dusty quilt, and beside it was a wooden rocking chair that was moving back and forth on its own. I froze. The chair slowed to a stop as if it had just noticed me standing there. The tapping sound was gone now, replaced by an eerie silence that made my ears ring. I stepped into the room cautiously, shining my flashlight around. There wasn't much to see, just old furniture and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. But something felt off. It felt like I wasn't alone anymore. On the bedside table, there was a small leather-bound book covered in dust. I picked it up and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, some neat and tidy, others scribbled frantically like they'd been written in a hurry. The first few pages seemed normal enough, lists of household chores, reminders about family events. But as I flipped through, the writing became darker and more desperate. "Something is wrong," one entry read. "The children keep waking up screaming about shadows in their room." Another entry said, "I hear whispers at night when everyone is asleep. They're coming from behind the locked door downstairs." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. Was this family hearing the same whispers I thought I'd heard earlier? The final entry was barely legible. "It's here now, watching us. Waiting." My hands were shaking as I closed the book and put it back on the table. Suddenly, I heard something behind me. A soft creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. I spun around quickly, shining my flashlight toward the doorway, but there was nothing there. Just an empty hallway stretching into darkness. I decided to leave the room and keep exploring upstairs. Something told me there were more answers hidden here. Answers about what happened to this family and why everyone in the village feared this house so much. At the end of another hallway upstairs, I found what looked like an old library filled with shelves of dusty books and papers scattered across the floor. In one corner of the room was a desk with an oil lamp sitting on top of it. I walked over to the desk and started looking through some of the papers lying there. Most of them were old letters and bills. Nothing unusual. But then I found something strange. A photograph. It showed a man standing in front of the Blackwood Manor with his wife and 2 children. The same family from the portrait downstairs, but something about their faces looked wrong in this photo. Distorted somehow. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too dark. Behind them, standing just inside one of the windows of the mansion, was a shadowy figure watching them. I stared at the photograph for what felt like forever. My hands were trembling, but I couldn't look away. That shadowy figure in the window. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was there, standing perfectly still, watching the family. I tried to convince myself it was just a smudge on the photo, or maybe damage from age, but deep down, I knew better. Something about it felt wrong. I shoved the photo into my bag and turned to leave the library. That's when I heard it again. The tapping sound. But this time, it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from downstairs, near the locked doctor I'd seen earlier. My heart started racing as I made my way back down the creaky staircase. The house felt different now. heavier somehow, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Every step echoed loudly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The tapping had stopped again, but now there was a faint scratching sound coming from behind the locked door at the end of the hallway. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door and trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of the house and never look back, but another part of me, the part that got me into this line of work, needed to know what was behind that door. I took a deep breath and walked toward it. The scratches grew louder as I got closer, like whatever was on the other side knew I was coming. When I reached the door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were symbols carved into the wood around the edges of the frame. They looked old and strange, like something out of a book about witchcraft or ancient rituals. I tried, turning the handle again, but it was still locked. Frustrated, I looked around for something to force it open. In one corner of the hallway, I found an old crowbar leaning against the wall, almost like someone had left it there on purpose. I grabbed it and wedged it into the gap between the door and its frame. With a loud crack, the lock broke, and the door swung open slowly. The room beyond was pitch black, even with my flashlight shining into it. The air inside was freezing cold and smelled metallic, like blood or rust. I stepped inside cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The first thing I saw were symbols painted on the walls in what looked like dried blood. The same symbols that had been carved into the doorframe outside. In the center of the room was a small table covered in melted candle wax and strange objects. Bones tied together with string, jars filled with murky liquid, and an old wooden box with intricate carvings on its surface. But what caught my attention most was what hung on the wall directly across from me. A large mirror with a black frame covered in more of those strange symbols. The mirror didn't reflect my flashlight beam properly. It seemed to absorb it instead, making its surface look like an endless void. As I stepped closer to examine it, something moved in its depths. At first, I thought it was just my reflection shifting as I moved closer, but then I realized that whatever was in there wasn't copying my movements. It was watching me. Before I could react, a loud bang echoed through the house, like a door slamming, shut somewhere upstairs. I spun around quickly but saw nothing behind me except darkness. When I turned back toward the mirror, my reflection was gone. Instead of my face staring back at me from its surface, there were dozens of faces. Pale and distorted, pressing against what looked like glass from inside. Their mouths were open as if they were screaming silently. And then, one of them moved, its hand pressed against the inside of the mirror's surface as if trying to push through. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at reflections at all. These were people, or what was left of them, trapped inside this thing. Suddenly, whispers filled the room, soft at first but growing louder until they were deafening. "Help us," they said over and over again in voices that didn't sound entirely human. My flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely. In total darkness now, all I could hear were those whispers. And then, footsteps behind me. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I gripped the flashlight tightly, even though it wasn't working anymore. It was the only thing I had to hold on to. I didn't dare turn around. Whatever was behind me, I didn't want to see it. The whispers from the mirror grew louder, overlapping until they were just noise, chaotic and impossible to understand. The faces inside the mirror were moving faster now, pressing against the glass like they were trying to escape. "Help us," one voice said again, clearer than the rest. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I just wanted the noise to stop, but I reached out and touched the mirror's surface. It was ice cold, colder than anything I'd ever felt before. For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the footsteps stopped, Even my own breathing felt like it had been swallowed by the darkness. And then, the mirror pulled me in. It wasn't like stepping through a doorway or falling. It was like being dragged underwater. Everything around me felt heavy and suffocating. And when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the room anymore. I was somewhere else entirely. The world inside the mirror was dark and endless, like a void that stretched forever in every direction. The air was thick and cold, and shadows moved around me like living things. I could hear faint voices echoing in the distance, crying, begging, screaming, but I couldn't see anyone. "Alex," a voice whispered behind me. I turned quickly and saw one of the faces from the mirror standing there, a pale figure with hollow eyes and twisted features. It looked human once, but not anymore. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in a voice that sounded like broken glass. Before I could respond, more figures appeared, dozens of them, all pale and distorted like the first one. They surrounded me, their hollow eyes staring as if they could see right through me. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking. They didn't answer right away. Instead, they moved closer until they were only inches away from me. "We want out," one of them whispered. Another one spoke. "You can free us." "How?" I asked. They pointed behind me to something glowing faintly in the darkness, a small object sitting on a pedestal made of black stone. When I walked closer to it, I realized it was the wooden box I'd seen earlier on the table in the locked room. "Destroy it," one of them said. I hesitated. Something about this felt wrong, like they weren't telling me everything. "What happens if I destroy it?" I asked. The figures didn't answer right away. Instead, their faces twisted into something darker, angrier. "Do it!" They screamed in unison, their voices echoing so loudly that it made my head feel like it was splitting open. I grabbed the box without thinking and threw it onto the ground as hard as I could. The moment it shattered into pieces, everything changed. The figures screamed, high-pitched and unnatural, and began to dissolve into shadows that swirled around me violently. The void started collapsing in on itself, pulling everything, including me, toward its center. I closed my eyes and braced myself for whatever was about to happen next. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in the room with the mirror, but something was different. The mirror's surface was cracked now, its once glowing frame darkened and lifeless. The whispers were gone, replaced by silence so deep that it felt almost peaceful. But then, I noticed something else. The faces inside the mirror were gone too, except for one. My own reflection stared back at me from its shattered surface. But there was something wrong with it. Its eyes weren't mine anymore. They were hollow, just like theirs had been. I stood there, frozen, staring at the mirror. My reflection was wrong. Its hollow eyes stared back at me like it was alive, like it was something else entirely. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. It felt like the mirror was holding me there, forcing me to face whatever I had unleashed. Finally, I snapped out of it and stumbled backward, almost falling over the broken pieces of the wooden box on the floor. My flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, casting a shaky beam of light across the room. The whispers were gone. The tapping was gone. The house was silent now, but the silence didn't feel comforting. It felt heavy, like the air was still thick with something I couldn't see. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the room, down the hallway, and out of the mansion as fast as I could. The front door slammed shut behind me on its own, and for a moment I thought I heard faint laughter coming from inside. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me 3 tries to get the keys into the ignition. As soon as the engine roared to life, I sped down the dirt road without looking back. When I got home that night, I locked every door and window in my apartment and sat in silence for hours. My mind kept replaying everything that had happened. The faces in the mirror, the voices begging for help, the way my reflection had stared at me with hollow eyes. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that maybe I had imagined it all, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I wrote my article about Blackwood Manor. I described its eerie history and the strange things people said about it, but I left out everything that had happened to me inside. No one would believe me anyway. Still, even after finishing the article and sending it off to my editor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. It started small at first. Little things like shadows moving in corners, where there shouldn't be shadows or faint whispers when I was alone in a room. But then it got worse. One night, while brushing my teeth in front of the bathroom mirror, I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't moving exactly like me. It was just a fraction slower, like it was hesitating before copying my movements, froze and stared at it for what felt like hours before finally turning away. After that night, mirrors became unbearable for me. Every time I looked into one, even just for a second, I felt like something was watching me from inside. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers coming from my reflection, or see movement out of the corner of my eye that didn't match what I was doing. It wasn't long before I started covering all the mirrors in my apartment with sheets or turning them around so they faced the wall. But no matter what I did, I could still feel them watching. Now, months later, I don't leave my apartment much anymore. The world outside feels distant, like it's not really mine anymore. Sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and dark, I hear tapping sounds coming from behind my covered mirrors. And sometimes, just sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those hollow faces staring back at me, waiting. My name is Dan Keller. I'm 32 years old, a former Marine, and now a fire lookout. I've been through things most people wouldn't believe. War, loss, sleepless nights haunted by memories, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced in that tower. It was the fall of 1953 when I took the job. I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the guilt. The Adirondack Mountains seemed perfect. Quiet, isolated, surrounded by nothing but miles of trees. It felt like the kind of place where I could finally breathe again. The Fire Watch Tower was perched high on a hill, overlooking an endless sea of pine trees. It was old and creaky, but sturdy enough to survive decades of storms. The air smelled crisp, mixed with the faint scent of dry leaves. The forest had been in a drought for months, which made my job even more important. One spark out there could turn the whole place into ash. When I arrived at the tower, everything seemed normal at first. The previous lookout had left behind some supplies, a lantern, canned food, and a logbook. The logbook caught my attention right away because it wasn't just filled with notes about smoke sightings or weather conditions. The entries were strange. Day 12. Heard whispers again last night. They're closer now. Day 20. Trees moved while I wasn't looking. Impossible to explain. Day 27. Don't go near the northern ridge. I thought it was just paranoia or boredom getting to him. Spending weeks alone in a place like this could mess with anyone's head. But then I found something else. A small wooden carving tucked under the bed frame. It looked like a person, but its body was twisted and stretched unnaturally, almost like it was growing into a tree. I brushed it off as someone's weird hobby and settled into my routine. Every day, I climbed up to the observation deck with my binoculars and scanned the horizon for smoke or anything unusual. At night, I'd sit by the radio and listen to static while eating canned beans or jerky. But even during those first few days, something felt off. The forest wasn't quiet in a peaceful way. It was too quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves from squirrels or deer, just silence, like the whole place was holding its breath. One night, as I sat on the deck staring out at the moonlit trees, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, It was faint, almost like wind brushing through branches, but it wasn't random. It sounded like words being spoken just out of reach. I froze and listened harder, but it stopped as suddenly as it started. Probably just my imagination, told myself as I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The next morning brought more strange things. While walking around the base of the tower to check for signs of wear or damage, I noticed something odd about the trees nearby. They were perfectly aligned in geometric patterns. Squares, triangles, shapes that didn't seem natural at all. Tried not to think too much about it until later that night when the whispers came back. Louder this time. They weren't words anymore. They were sounds. Low hums mixed with faint clicking noises that made my skin crawl. I leaned out of the window to see if someone was out there playing tricks on me, but all I saw were shadows stretching across the ground under the pale moonlight. That's when I realized something else. The shadows weren't moving with the wind or shifting naturally like they should have been. They were watching me. The next few days felt like a blur. I tried to focus on my job, checking for smoke, logging, weather updates, keeping the tower in good condition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers didn't stop. They came every night, growing louder and closer, like they were circling the tower. I wasn't alone out here, though. Every week, Maria Cortez flew in with supplies. She was a pilot who worked for the Forestry Service, delivering food and equipment to fire lookouts like me. Maria was tough but friendly, always cracking jokes to lighten the mood. When she landed her plane on the small strip near the tower, I decided to ask her about the strange things I'd been noticing. "Hey, Maria," I said as we unloaded boxes from her plane. "You ever hear anything weird about this place?" He stopped and looked at me, her smile fading. "Weird? How? Like whispers at night? Or trees that don't look right?" Maria hesitated before answering. "There are stories about these woods," she said quietly. "Old legends from the tribes who lived here long before us. They say the forest has guardians, ancient spirits that protect it from harm." I raised an eyebrow. "Guardians?" she nodded. "They're not friendly, Dan. If you disrespect the forest or cross into their territory, they'll make sure you regret it." I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Sounds like campfire stories to me." Maria didn't laugh. She just gave me a serious look and said, "Be careful out here." After she left, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Guardians? Spirits? It sounded ridiculous, but part of me wondered if there was some truth to it. The next night, something happened that made me question everything. I was sitting on the observation deck with Lucky, a fox that had been hanging around the tower since I arrived. He wasn't exactly tame, but he seemed comfortable enough to stay close by as long as I didn't try to touch him. Lucky suddenly perked up, his ears twitching and his eyes fixed on the trees below. He let out a low growl, something I'd never heard him do before. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. That's when I saw it. A flicker of movement between the trees. At first, I thought it was a deer, or maybe a bear, but then it stepped into view under the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, too tall to be human, with limbs that looked like twisted branches and skin that blended into the bark of nearby trees. Its head turned slowly toward the tower, and even though I couldn't see its face clearly, I felt its gaze pierce through me. Lucky bolted down the stairs and disappeared into the woods. I stayed frozen in place, unable to move or look away as the figure melted back into the shadows of the forest. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever, and now they sounded like voices calling my name. Dan. Dan. I locked every door and window in the tower and sat in silence until dawn. When morning came, I decided to explore the area around the tower again. Maybe I could find some explanation for what I'd seen, or convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As I walked through the woods with my binoculars slung around my neck and a flashlight in hand, just in case, I noticed something strange about the ground near the northern ridge. A perfect circle of disturbed earth surrounded by scattered hiking gear, boots, backpacks, water bottles, all neatly arranged within the circle as if someone had placed them there deliberately. But there were no signs of people, no footprints leading away from the site, and no blood or signs of struggle. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Reported it over the radio to headquarters, but they brushed it off as a prank or a misunderstanding. "Just keep an eye out," they said casually. That night, as I sat in bed staring at the logbook left behind by the previous lookout, I realized something chilling. The entries weren't just random ramblings from a paranoid man. They were warnings. And now it felt like those warnings were meant for me. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained. I hadn't slept much. The whispers had been louder than ever, circling the tower like a storm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing in the woods. The way it moved. The way it seemed to blend into the trees like it belonged there. I decided to call Elijah Banks, a local hunter who lived about 10 miles from the tower. I'd met him once during my first week here when he came by to check on me. He was an older man with a thick beard and a quiet demeanor, but he knew these woods better than anyone. If anyone could explain what was going on, it was him. "Elijah," I said over the radio, my voice shaking slightly. "Have you ever seen anything strange out here? Like something that doesn't belong?" There was a long pause before he answered. "What did you see?" I hesitated. "I don't know how to describe it. It looked like a person, but not really. Its skin looked like bark, and it moved like it was part of the forest." Elijah's voice dropped to a whisper. "You saw them." "Who?" I asked, gripping the radio tightly. "The Pine Walkers," he said. "They've been here longer than any of us. Longer than this tower, longer than the towns nearby. They're not human, Dan. They're something else." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do they want?" "They don't want anything," Elijah replied. "They protect the forest. If you've seen them, it means you've crossed into their territory." I thought about the strange geometric patterns in the trees and the circle of hiking gear near the ridge. Had I stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see? "What do I do?" I asked. Elijah sighed heavily. "Stay inside at night. Don't go near the northern ridge again. And whatever you do, don't try to fight them." His words didn't make me feel any better. That afternoon, as I climbed up to the observation deck with my binoculars, I noticed something strange about the trees below. They were marked with symbols carved into their bark. At first glance, they looked like random scratches, but when I looked closer through my binoculars, I realized they formed patterns. Triangles, circles, spirals. It hit me then. These weren't just random markings. They were boundaries. The Pine Walkers weren't just wandering aimlessly through the forest, they were guarding something. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the ground like long fingers, I heard Lucky's growl again from outside the tower. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the deck cautiously, scanning the area below for any sign of movement. That's when I saw Elijah standing at the edge of the clearing near the northern ridge. "Elijah!" I called out, relieved to see someone familiar, but he didn't respond. I shined my flashlight toward him and froze in place. It wasn't Elijah, not anymore. His body was twisted and stretched unnaturally, his arms elongated like branches reaching for sunlight. His skin had turned rough and grayish-brown, blending into the bark of nearby trees. And his face was gone. He was becoming one of them, a Pine Walker. I stumbled backward into the tower and locked myself inside as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The whispers grew louder that night, angrier somehow, and now they sounded like voices overlapping each other in a chaotic hum. "Dan, leave. Leave." I didn't sleep at all. I didn't know how much longer I could stay in that tower. Every night felt worse than the one before. The whispers weren't just outside anymore. They were inside my head. I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was losing my mind. Either way, I felt trapped. The next day, I tried to distract myself by focusing on my job. I climbed up to the observation deck with my binoculars and scanned the horizon for smoke, or anything unusual, but my hands were shaky, and my mind kept drifting back to Elijah, to what he had become. As the sun set and the shadows grew longer, I heard something new, a voice calling out from the woods. Dan, help me. I froze. It sounded like Maria. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned over the railing, scanning the trees below. Maria, I called out. Help me, the voice repeated, softer this time. It was coming from the northern ridge, the same place Elijah had warned me about. I knew I shouldn't go out there. Every instinct told me to stay inside and lock the door. But what if Maria was in trouble? What if her plane had crashed nearby and she needed help? I grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife I kept for emergencies, then headed down the stairs into the clearing. The air felt colder than usual, and every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. Maria, I called again as I walked toward the ridge. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing twisted branches and patches of dry leaves on the ground. Then I saw it, a red scarf tangled in a bush near the ridge. It looked just like the one Maria always wore when she flew in with supplies. I rushed over to grab it, but as soon as I touched it, I heard a sound behind me, a low, clicking noise mixed with faint whispers. I turned around slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. They were there, 3 of them, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Their bodies were tall and thin, their limbs stretched unnaturally like they'd grown out of the ground itself. Their skin looked like bark, blending perfectly into the trees behind them. And their faces, they didn't have faces, just smooth surfaces where eyes and mouths should have been. One of them stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate like it was studying me. "Stay back," I shouted, holding up my knife even though I knew it wouldn't do any good. The whispers grew louder around me, overlapping each other until they sounded like a deafening roar in my ears. Leave. Leave. The pine walkers didn't attack. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to make me feel like I was suffocating. My chest tightened, and my legs felt weak as if the ground beneath me was pulling me down. I stumbled backward toward the tower, barely able to keep my balance as they watched me silently from the shadows. When I finally made it back inside, and locked the door behind me, I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped my flashlight. That's when I noticed something strange about the walls of the tower. They were changing. The wooden planks were warping and twisting like they were alive, growing inward toward me. The windows looked smaller than they had before, almost like they were being swallowed by bark. It was as if the tower itself was becoming part of the forest, part of them. I grabbed the radio and tried to call for help. "Headquarters, this is Keller. Do you read me?" Static filled the speaker for a moment before a faint voice broke through. "Dan," it said softly. "Come outside." It wasn't headquarters. It was them. I threw the radio across the room and backed into a corner as shadows stretched across the floor toward me. The whispers surrounded me completely now, filling every inch of space with their eerie hum. I realized then that there was no escaping them. Not in this tower, not in these woods. They weren't just protecting their territory. They were claiming it. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first I thought the tower was on fire. I jumped up and looked out the window, expecting flames, but it wasn't the tower. It was the forest. A wildfire had started somewhere to the west, and it was spreading fast. Thick clouds of smoke rolled through the trees, turning the sky orange. The sight should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe the fire would drive them away. The pine walkers, maybe it would destroy whatever was keeping them here. But as I stared out at the burning forest, I saw them again. They were moving toward the tower, dozens of them now, their tall bodies blending into the smoke like shadows. The fire didn't seem to bother them at all. They stopped at the edge of the clearing around the tower, forming a circle just like the one I'd seen near the northern ridge. It felt like they were waiting for something, or someone. I grabbed my knife and flashlight again, even though I knew they wouldn't help me. My hands were shaking as I stepped onto the observation deck, trying to keep my breathing steady. "What do you want?" I shouted into the smoke-filled air. The whispers answered me, soft at first but growing louder with every passing second. "Leave. Leave." It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. That's when I realized what they wanted. It wasn't me. They wanted the tower. This place wasn't just a fire lookout, it was built over something ancient, something that belonged to them. I thought about Elijah's warning. Don't try to fight them. But what choice did I have? If they took this tower, there'd be nothing stopping them from spreading beyond the forest, from claiming everything in their path. I ran back inside and grabbed a canister of kerosene from under the bed. If they wanted this tower so badly, I'd give it to them, but not in one piece. I poured the kerosene over the wooden floors and walls, ignoring how they seemed to twist and grow under my touch. The whispers grew louder as if they knew what I was doing. "Leave. Leave." I lit a match and dropped it onto the floor. Flames erupted instantly, climbing up the walls like hungry vines. The heat was overwhelming, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. If this was their shrine or their anchor to this world, then destroying it was my only chance. The pine walkers didn't move as the fire spread through the tower. They just stood there in their circle, watching silently as flames consumed everything around me. I thought I'd done it. I thought I'd won. But then one of them stepped forward. It climbed up to the observation deck with slow, deliberate movements, its bark-like skin cracking under the heat but never burning completely. When it reached me, it didn't attack. It just touched my arm with one of its elongated fingers. The pain was immediate, sharp and searing. And then it stopped. When I looked down at my arm, I saw something horrifying. Bark had started growing over my skin. I stumbled backward into the flames, trying to shake off whatever they'd done to me. But it was too late. The transformation had already begun. The last thing I remember before blacking out was falling through the burning floorboards as the tower collapsed around me. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed surrounded by doctors and nurses. They told me firefighters had found me unconscious near the edge of the forest after putting out the wildfire. They said I was lucky to be alive, but they didn't know about my arm. The bark-like growth hadn't stopped. It had spread up to my shoulder now, twisting into patterns that looked eerily similar to those markings on the trees near the ridge. I didn't stay in that hospital for long. One night, while everyone else was asleep, I slipped out and disappeared, into the woods. I don't know why. I don't know what's happening to me. But part of me feels like I belong there now, like I'm becoming one of them. The last time anyone saw me was near a regrowth zone where new trees were sprouting after the fire. Some say they saw a man walking among those trees, tall and thin with bark-like skin blending into his surroundings. Maybe it wasn't me anymore. Or maybe it still was. My name is Marty Redstone, and I've always been a man of reason. I work as an archaeologist, traveling to different places to uncover stories buried in the earth. It's not exactly a job that screams excitement to most people, but for me, it's a way to connect with the past and make sense of the present, At least, that's how I used to feel, before everything changed. It all started when I took on a project at Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado. The park is famous for its ancient cliff dwellings built by the ancestral Puebloans. It's beautiful. Red rocks, deep canyons, and skies so clear you can see every star at night. But there was something about this place that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but you know that feeling when someone's watching you? That's how it felt from the moment I arrived. I wasn't alone on this trip. My 12-year-old son, Jake, was with me. Jake had been staying with me ever since his mom and I divorced last year. He was a curious kid, always asking questions, always wanting to explore. I thought bringing him along would be good for both of us, a chance to bond and maybe distract him from everything going on at home. The first few days were uneventful. We set up camp near one of the excavation sites, a spot where my team believed we might find artifacts from an unrecorded period of Puebloan history. Jake spent most of his time sketching in his notebook or climbing rocks nearby while I worked. But then, small things started happening. On our second night, I heard footsteps outside our tent. At first, I thought it was just one of the crew members walking around, but when I stepped out to check, there was no one there, just the sound of the wind whistling through the canyon. "Dad?" Jake called from inside the tent. "Is someone out there?" "No one," I said, trying to sound calm. "Probably just an animal." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next day, one of my colleagues mentioned hearing strange noises too, like whispers carried on the wind. We laughed it off as our imaginations playing tricks on us. After all, we were in an isolated area surrounded by nature. Strange sounds were bound to happen. By the fourth day, things got weirder. Jake came running, up to me while I was cataloging some pottery shards. "Dad, you called me?" he asked out of breath. I frowned. "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did," he insisted. "I heard you calling my name from over there." He pointed toward a cluster of trees about 50 yards away. I looked at him closely. He wasn't joking. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly. "Jake," I said firmly, "I didn't call you." He stared at me for a moment before nodding slowly. Maybe it was just my imagination. But it wasn't just his imagination. Not this time. That night, as we sat by the campfire with some of the crew members, one of them, a young intern named Tommy, brought up something that sent a chill down my spine. "Have you guys heard about the legends around here?" he asked casually. "Legends?" someone replied. "Yeah," Tommy said. "The Navajo people have stories about things that can mimic voices and appearances. They call them skinwalkers." The group fell silent for a moment before someone laughed nervously and changed the subject. But I couldn't shake off what he'd said. It stuck with me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat outside our tent staring at the stars and thinking about what Tommy had said. Skinwalkers? Mimics? It sounded ridiculous. But then again, so did hearing footsteps when no one was there, or Jake swearing he'd heard my voice when he hadn't. As I sat there lost in thought, something moved in the corner of my vision. A shadow darting, between two rocks about 20 feet away. My heart skipped a beat as I stood up slowly. "Hello?" I called out into the darkness. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward where I'd seen the shadow, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and silence. I shook my head and muttered to myself as I went back into the tent. Maybe it really was just my imagination. Or maybe not. By the 6th day, the strange occurrences were starting to pile up. It wasn't just me or Jake noticing things anymore. Other members of the team were uneasy too. Tommy, the intern who had mentioned the Skinwalker legend, told me he'd seen something moving near the edge of camp the night before. He swore it looked like a person, but when he called out, it disappeared into the trees without a sound. "It's probably an animal," I told him, trying to keep things logical. "A coyote or something." Tommy nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Truth be told, I wasn't sure I believed myself either. Jake was quieter than usual that morning. Normally, he'd be running around with his sketchbook or asking me 100 questions about what we were digging up. But now, he just sat by the fire, staring into space. "You okay, buddy?" I asked him. He looked up at me and hesitated before answering. "I don't like it here, Dad." I crouched down beside him. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said softly. "It just feels wrong." I didn't know what to say to that. How do you explain a feeling like that? I ruffled his hair and told him not to worry, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. Later that day, we had a visitor at camp, a Navajo woman named Grace Tsosi. She was in her 60s, with long silver hair tied, back in a braid and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through you. Grace was one of the park rangers who worked in the area, and she'd come by to check on us. As we talked over coffee, Grace glanced around the camp and frowned slightly. "You've been hearing things at night, haven't you?" she asked. I froze for a moment before nodding slowly. "How did you know?" She sighed and set her mug down. "This land has a history," she said carefully. "A long history that goes back much further than those cliff dwellings you're digging up." "What kind of history?" I asked. Grace hesitated before answering. "There are stories," she said finally. "Stories about things that live out here. Things that aren't human." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You mean skinwalkers?" Grace's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at me. "You shouldn't say that word out loud," she said firmly. "Why not?" Jake asked from where he was sitting nearby. Grace turned to him and smiled gently. "Because names have power," she said simply. Jake didn't ask any more questions after that. Before Grace left, she handed me a small leather pouch tied with a string. "Keep this with you," she said quietly. "It's for protection." "What's in it?" I asked. "Medicine," she replied cryptically before walking away. That night, I kept the pouch in my pocket as we sat around the fire again. The team was quieter than usual. No one wanted to talk about what was happening, but we all felt it. The tension in the air, like something was watching us from just beyond the firelight. Jake sat close to me, his sketchbook balanced on his knees, as he doodled absent-mindedly. Tommy was poking at the fire with a stick when he suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Everyone went silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of wind through the canyon. But then, there it was, a faint rustling sound coming from the trees behind us. "Probably just an animal," one of the crew members muttered nervously. But then we heard it again, closer this time, and this time it wasn't rustling. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Who's out there?" Tommy called out shakily. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it toward the trees where the sound had come from. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. "See? Just your imagination," said quickly, trying to calm everyone down, but as I turned back toward the fire, Jake grabbed my arm tightly. His face was pale as he pointed toward something behind me. "Dad," he whispered. "It's you." I spun around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight, and for a moment, my heart stopped cold. Standing at the edge of the firelight was me, or at least something that looked like me. Same face, same clothes, but its expression was wrong, blank and empty like a doll's face. Before anyone could react, it turned and disappeared into the darkness without a sound. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. What we saw, what I saw, was impossible. But it happened. Jake stayed close to me, clutching my arm like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. Tommy didn't say a word, and the rest of the team avoided looking at me, like they were scared I'd turn into whatever that thing was. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe some kind of hallucination. But, deep down, I knew better. Jake did too. "Dad," he said quietly while we were packing up some gear for the day. What was that last night? I shook my head. I don't know. Do you think it's one of those things Grace talked about? He asked. I didn't answer. I didn't want to scare him any more than he already was. By now, everyone in camp was on edge. People were reporting strange things. Voices calling their names from the trees, shadows moving just out of sight, even footsteps following them when they were alone. One of the crew members quit and left the camp altogether, saying he couldn't take it anymore. Jake started having nightmares. He'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming, saying something was in the tent with us. I'd hold him and tell him it was just a bad dream, but I wasn't so sure anymore. On the 12th day, things took a turn for the worse. Tommy came running into camp just before sunset, his face pale and his hands shaking. I saw it, he gasped. I saw it again. What did you see? I asked. He pointed toward the canyon where we'd been working earlier that day. It was watching me. It looked like you. My stomach dropped. Are you sure? Yes, he said desperately. It had your face, Marty, but its eyes weren't right. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the canyon with Tommy and 2 other crew members following behind me. Jake wanted to come too, but I told him to stay in camp where it was safe, or at least safer than out there. As we walked through the canyon, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to roll in even though the sky was clear. Then we found it, or rather, we found them. At first glance, it looked like a group of people standing near one of the cliff walls. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. They weren't people. They looked like us, like me and Tommy and the others, but their movements were strange, jerky and unnatural like puppets on strings. Their faces were blank and emotionless, and their eyes were dark and empty. One of them turned toward us slowly, its head tilting to one side as if studying us. "Run," I whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and sprinted back toward camp as fast as we could, not daring to look back until we were safely behind the firelight. "What are they?" Tommy asked breathlessly once we were back in camp. "I don't know," I admitted, "but they're not human." That night, Grace came back to check on us after hearing about what had happened in the canyon. When I told her what we'd seen, she nodded grimly. "They're mimics," she said simply. "They take on your appearance to lure you away." "Why?" Jake asked nervously. Grace hesitated before answering. "To feed," she said finally. "Feed? On what?" Tommy asked. She looked at him with an expression so serious it made my skin crawl. "Your soul." The next few days were a blur of fear and paranoia. No one wanted to leave camp unless they absolutely had to, and even then, we always went in pairs or groups. Jake stayed close to me at all times. He wouldn't even go to the bathroom without me standing outside the tent waiting for him. But no matter how careful we were, things kept getting worse. On the 15th day, Jake disappeared. It happened during dinner when everyone was gathered around the fire eating and talking quietly about what we should do next. Whether we should stay, or pack up and leave altogether. Jake had been sitting beside me moments earlier when suddenly he wasn't there anymore. "Jake!" I called out, my voice rising in panic as I stood up and looked around frantically. No answer. The others helped me search for him immediately, shining flashlights into every corner of camp and calling his name over and over again until our voices were hoarse. Then we heard it. A faint voice calling from somewhere deep in the canyon. "Dad! Help!" It sounded like Jake, but something about it felt wrong. Grace grabbed my arm tightly before I could run toward the sound. "Don't go," she said urgently. "But that's my son," I protested desperately. She shook her head firmly. "It's not him." Jake was gone, and I felt like my world had just collapsed. Every parent's worst nightmare was staring me in the face. I couldn't think straight. I just wanted to run into the canyon and find him. But Grace held me back, her grip firm despite her age. "Listen to me," she said sharply. "If you go now, you won't come back." I stared at her, my chest heaving. "That's my son out there." Grace didn't let go. "And if you rush in blindly, you'll be walking into its trap." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew she was right. Whatever was out there wasn't Jake. But what if Jake really was in trouble? What if he needed me? Grace pulled a small bundle from her bag and pressed it into my hands. It was another leather pouch, similar to the one she'd given me before, but larger and heavier. "This will help you see the truth," she said quietly. "What truth?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she began chanting softly in a language I didn't understand, sprinkling what looked like ash in a circle around us. The others stood back, watching nervously. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression so serious it made my stomach twist. "You'll see things you don't want to see," she warned. "But it's the only way to find your son." I nodded, gripping the pouch tightly as I stepped toward the edge of the canyon. The air felt different as I entered the canyon. Heavier, colder, like stepping into a room where something terrible had happened. The shadows seemed deeper here, and every sound echoed strangely, as if the canyon itself was alive. I called out Jake's name over and over again, my voice bouncing off the rock walls. At first, there was nothing, just silence and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it. "Dad!" It was faint but unmistakable. Jake's voice coming from somewhere ahead of me. "Jake!" I shouted, running toward the sound, but as I rounded a corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. There he was, or at least something that looked like him. He was standing in a small clearing near the base of a cliff wall, his back turned to me. "Jake?" I called out cautiously. He didn't move. I took a step closer. "Jake!" Slowly, he turned around, and that's when I realized it wasn't him. The thing standing before me looked like Jake. Same face, same clothes, but its eyes were wrong. They were dark and empty, like bottomless pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. "Dad," it said in Jake's voice, smiling, eerily as it took a step toward me. I stumbled backward instinctively, clutching Grace's pouch tightly as my heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't Jake. It was something else entirely. Suddenly, the pouch grew warm in my hands, and everything around me shifted. The canyon seemed darker now, more sinister, and the thing in front of me changed too. Its skin rippled like water, before peeling away to reveal something horrifying underneath. A twisted creature with long limbs and sharp claws, its face stretched into an unnatural grin filled with jagged teeth. It wasn't human, not even close. I ran blindly through the canyon, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I tried to get away from whatever that thing was. But no matter how fast I ran or how many turns I took, it always seemed to be just behind me, its footsteps echoing eerily through the darkness. Finally, I stumbled into a small chamber hidden behind a cluster of rocks. It was dark and cramped, but it felt safer than being out in the open. As I caught my breath, I noticed something strange on the walls of the chamber. Ancient pictographs carved into the stone. They depicted figures that looked human at first glance but had animal-like features. Claws instead of hands, elongated limbs, and faces twisted into grotesque shapes. In one corner of the chamber was a pile of bones, human bones, and among them was something that made my blood run cold, Jake's sketchbook. I grabbed it desperately and flipped through the pages. The drawings were just as he'd left them, pictures of animals and landscapes, but on the last page was something new. A crude sketch of a creature with dark eyes and sharp teeth, exactly like what I'd just seen. Grace found me hours later, near the entrance to the canyon. She didn't say anything. She just handed me another pouch and started chanting again. This time, her voice sounded stronger, more urgent. "What are you doing?" I asked shakily. "Preparing you," she said simply. "You're going to face it." I didn't want to face it. Every part of me wanted to grab Jake's sketchbook, pack up our things, and leave this cursed place behind. But I couldn't. Jake was still out there somewhere, and I wasn't going to stop until I found him, even if it meant confronting whatever that thing was. Grace led me deeper into the canyon the next morning. She carried a small bundle of herbs and feathers, muttering under her breath as we walked. The others stayed behind at camp. They were too scared to come with us, and honestly, I didn't blame them. "Where are we going?" I asked as we climbed. "Over a rocky ledge?" "To its lair," Grace said simply. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "How do you know where it is?" Grace stopped and looked at me with those sharp eyes of hers. "Because it wants you to find it." The canyon grew, darker as we went deeper, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, making it harder to breathe. Every sound seemed louder. The crunch of our boots on the rocks, the rustle of leaves in the wind, even the distant echo of water dripping somewhere far away. Finally, we reached a narrow opening in the cliffside, a jagged crack barely wide, enough for a person to squeeze through. "It's in there," Grace said quietly. I stared at the opening, my heart pounding. "How do you know?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "This is your protection," she said firmly. "Don't let go of it." I unwrapped the bundle carefully and found a small wooden figure carved into the shape of an animal. A wolf, I think, and a piece of red string tied around it. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Hold it," Grace said simply. "It will keep you grounded." I stepped into the crack in the cliffside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I squeezed through the narrow passage. Grace stayed behind. She said she couldn't go any further without risking her own safety. The passage opened up into a large chamber deep inside the cliff, a space so vast I couldn't see where it ended. The walls were covered in pictographs like the ones I'd seen before, twisted figures with claws and teeth, but these were different. They seemed alive somehow, shifting and moving as if they were watching me. In the center of the chamber was a pile of bones, human bones, and among them was something that made my stomach turn: Jake's backpack. I ran toward it, my hands shaking as I grabbed it and searched through its contents. His water bottle was still there, along with his notebook and a few snacks he'd packed for the trip. "Jake!" I shouted desperately, my voice echoing through the chamber. At first, there was nothing, just silence and shadows. But then I heard footsteps coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and there it was. The creature stepped into the light slowly, its twisted body hunched over like it was too big for its own skin. Its face stretched into that same unnatural grin filled with jagged teeth, and its dark eyes locked onto mine. It didn't speak at first, it just stared at me like it was studying me. Then it tilted its head slightly and said in Jake's voice, "Dad!" My grip tightened around Grace's wooden figure as I took a step back. "Where's my son?" I demanded. The creature smiled wider, its teeth glinting in the flashlight beam. "He's here," it said softly. "What do you mean?" I asked shakily. It didn't answer directly. Instead, it reached out one long clawed hand toward me. And that's when I saw them, shadows moving behind it like puppets on strings. They looked human at first glance, like Jake and Tommy and even Grace, but their movements were jerky and unnatural like before. They weren't real. They were copies. You'd him go, I shouted angrily. The creature laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the chamber like thunder. "You can have him back," it said finally, "but only if you give me something in return." "What do you want?" I asked desperately, leaned closer until its twisted face was inches from mine. "You," it whispered. I froze as its words sank in. It wanted me. My life for Jake's, that was its offer. Grace's warning echoed in my mind. Don't let go of your protection. I gripped the wooden figure tightly as I stared into those dark eyes, trying to think clearly despite my fear. "No deal," I said firmly. The creature snarled angrily and lunged toward me, but before it could reach me, Grace's pouch began to glow faintly in my pocket. The air around us shifted suddenly as if something powerful had been unleashed. The creature screamed, a horrible sound that made my ears ring as its body began to twist and contort violently. Shadows swirled around us like a storm as Grace's medicine worked its magic, forcing the entity back into dormancy. When everything finally stopped, the chamber was silent again, and Jake was standing there in front of me, his face pale but alive. "Dad?" he whispered weakly. I ran toward him and pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down my face as relief washed over me. It's been 3 years since that day in the canyon. 3 years since I faced that thing and brought Jake back. But even now, it feels like it happened yesterday. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing its voice in my dreams. Other nights, I see its dark eyes staring at me from the shadows of my room. Jake doesn't talk about it much. He's older now, 15, and he's trying to move on with his life, but I can tell it still haunts him too. Sometimes I catch him staring out the window for long stretches of time, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. When I ask him what he's thinking about, he just shakes his head and says, "Nothing, but I know better." After we left Mesa Verde, I tried to go back to work, to bury myself in my job and forget everything that happened. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I stepped onto a new site or picked up a piece of ancient pottery, I felt that same heavy presence watching me, like it had followed me home. I reached out to Grace a few months after we left the park, hoping she could give me some answers, or at least some peace of mind. But when I called the ranger station where she worked, they told me she'd passed away just days after we left. "Heart failure," they said. I didn't believe it. Grace was strong, stronger than anyone I'd ever met. Whatever happened to her, it wasn't natural. Jake and I moved to a small town in Montana not long after that. It's quiet here, no cliffs or canyons or ancient ruins to remind us of what we went through. But even here, far away from Mesa Verde, there are moments when the past catches up with us. A few weeks ago, Jake came running into the house late at night, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked, rushing to his side. "I saw it," he whispered shakily. "Outside." I froze. "Saw what?" He hesitated before answering. "You." My heart sank as I pulled him into a hug, trying to calm him down. "It's not real," I said, firmly. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The truth is, I don't know if we'll ever be free of it, whatever it is. Grace told me we'd forced it into dormancy that day in the canyon, but she never said. It was gone for good. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the wind is howling outside, I feel its presence again. Watching. Waiting. A few days ago, I found something strange on our front porch. A small leather pouch tied with a red string. The same kind Grace had given me back then. There was no note, no sign of who might have left it. But when I opened it, there was a single word carved into the wood inside. Soon. I don't know what it means or who left it there. But one thing is clear. This isn't over, not yet. My name is Frank Donnelly, and I've been a forest ranger for over 15 years. I've seen a lot during my time, wildfires, animal attacks, lost hikers, but nothing prepared me for what happened last autumn in the Black Ridge Mountains. It was supposed to be just another routine patrol, but it turned into something I'll never forget. Something I wish I could forget. The Black Ridge Mountains are beautiful, especially in the fall. The trees turn shades of orange and red, and the air smells crisp and clean. But there's always been something off about this place. Locals tell stories about strange happenings, lights in the sky, eerie sounds at night, people disappearing, without a trace. I never paid much attention to those stories. I'm a man of facts, not superstition. On that particular day, I was heading out on a solo patrol. My dog Max was with me as always. He's a big German shepherd with a nose for trouble and a heart of gold. The weather was colder than usual for October, and the wind had a bite to it. The forest was unusually quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves. Just silence. It felt like the trees were holding their breath. As we walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Max seemed uneasy too. His ears kept twitching and he'd stop every few steps to sniff the air. "Relax, buddy," I said, patting his head. "It's just another day in the woods." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. About an hour into our hike, we came across something strange. A backpack lying in the middle of the trail. It looked brand new, like someone had just bought it yesterday. There were no signs of anyone around, no footprints or broken branches nearby. Just the backpack sitting there like it had been dropped from the sky. I picked it up and checked inside. There were some basic supplies, a water bottle, a flashlight, a map, but no ID or anything to tell me who it belonged to. "Weird," I muttered to myself. Max growled softly, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze but didn't see anything unusual. Just more trees and shadows stretching across the ground as the sun dipped lower in the sky. "Come on," I said, slinging the backpack over my shoulder. "Let's keep moving." As we continued down the trail, things started to get even stranger. We found a deer lying dead near a stream. Not unusual in itself, but there was no blood anywhere. Not on its body, not on the ground around it. It looked like it had just stopped living. Max whined and backed away from the deer like he wanted. Nothing to do with it. I didn't blame him. It gave me chills, too. Something about this wasn't right. By now, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The air felt heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on my chest. As much as I wanted to turn back and call it a day, my gut told me to keep going. We reached an old campsite about half an hour later, a spot that hadn't been used in years but still had remnants of tents and fire pits scattered around. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Claw marks on one of the trees near the edge of camp. They weren't from any animal I'd ever seen, too big for a bear or cougar and too deep for anything else that lived around here. Max barked sharply at nothing in particular before running toward one of the tents that had collapsed long ago. "Max, get back here!" I shouted as I chased after him. Inside what was left of the tent was another clue. A notebook filled with scribbled notes about geology and strange formations in these mountains. The name on the front read, Professor Weaver, a geologist who'd gone missing 2 weeks ago while studying rock formations in Black Ridge. I felt a chill run down my spine as Max whimpered softly beside me. Something wasn't right here. I stood there for a moment, staring at the name on the notebook. Professor Weaver. The professor had been all over the local news a couple of weeks ago when he disappeared. He was supposed to be studying some unusual rock formations in these mountains, but no one had seen or heard from him since. Search teams had looked for days, but found nothing. And now, here I was, holding his notebook in my hands. I flipped through the pages. Most of it was technical stuff about rocks and minerals, things I didn't understand. But then I came across something that made me pause. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "The mountains are alive." "What the hell does that mean?" I muttered under my breath. Max let out a low growl, his ears pinned back as he stared into the trees behind me. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. "Easy, boy," I said, trying to calm both him and myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I decided to take the notebook with me and head back to my cabin to report what I'd found. As much as I wanted to keep searching for more clues, something about this place felt wrong, like we were being watched. We started back down the trail, but it wasn't long before we came across something else, something even stranger than the backpack or the deer. A circle of trees ahead of us had been bent and twisted into unnatural shapes, like they'd been melted and then frozen in place. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the bizarre sight. The trees looked almost alive, their branches curling toward each other like they were reaching out to hold hands. The air around them felt colder too, like stepping into a freezer. Max barked sharply and pulled at his leash, trying to drag me away from the area. All right, I said, backing away slowly. We're leaving. As we continued down the trail, I couldn't help but feel like we were being followed. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint crunch of leaves behind us or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But whenever I turned around, there was nothing there. The sun had almost completely set by now, and the forest was getting darker by the second. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, its beam cutting through the shadows ahead of us. Max stayed close to my side, his tail tucked between his legs. We were about halfway back to my cabin when we found another clue. A small campsite that looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The fire pit was cold, and there were no signs of anyone around, but scattered on the ground were more papers covered in Professor Weaver's handwriting. I picked one up and read it under the flashlight's beam. They're not just mountains. They're something else. Something ancient. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I read those words. What was Weaver talking about? Was he losing his mind out here? Or was there really something strange going on in these mountains? Before I could think too much about it, Max started barking again, loud and frantic this time. He was facing a dense patch of trees just off the trail, his body rigid with fear. "Max! Quiet!" I hissed, trying to calm him down. But then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound coming from deep within the forest. It wasn't thunder or wind. It sounded alive. I froze in place, listening as the rumbling grew louder and seemed to move closer. The ground beneath my feet vibrated slightly, like something massive was shifting underground. "Time to go," I whispered to Max as I grabbed his leash and started walking as fast as I could without breaking into a run. But just as we were about to leave the campsite behind us, my flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn it," I muttered, smacking it against my hand to try and get it working again. The darkness closed in around us like a heavy blanket, and for a moment, all I could hear was Max's heavy breathing and that strange rumbling sound in the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the flashlight flickered back on, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of glowing eyes staring at us from between the trees. I froze. My flashlight beam caught the glowing eyes in the trees. Yellow, unblinking, and too many to count. They didn't move. They just stared, like they were waiting for something. Max growled low in his throat, his fur bristling as he pressed against my leg. I didn't dare move. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Wolves? No. Their eyes wouldn't glow like that. Deer? Maybe, but deer don't usually act this way. Whatever it was, I knew one thing. I didn't want to stick around to find out. Slowly, I backed away, keeping the flashlight pointed at the eyes. "Easy," I whispered to Max. "We're leaving." The eyes stayed where they were, watching us as we moved down the trail. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to keep walking, steady and slow. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the glowing eyes disappeared into the darkness behind us. The rumbling sound faded too, leaving only the crunch of our footsteps on the trail and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I'd been holding it the whole time. "What the hell is going on here?" I muttered under my breath. Max didn't answer, of course, but he seemed just as shaken as I was. His tail stayed tucked between his legs, and he kept glancing over his shoulder every few steps. We finally reached my cabin just as full darkness settled over the mountains. It's a small place, just one room with a bed, a table, and a wood stove, but it's always felt safe. Tonight, though, it felt different. The shadows seemed darker than usual, and the wind outside sounded almost angry. I locked the door behind us and turned on every light in the cabin. Max curled up on his bed in the corner but kept his head up, his ears twitching at every little sound outside. I sat down at the table and spread out Professor Weaver's notebook and papers in front of me. The words he'd written kept running through my head. The mountains are alive. Something ancient. I flipped through more pages of his notes, trying to make sense of them. Most of it was about geology, layers of rock formations, seismic activity, but then there were sections that didn't make any sense at all. One page had a drawing of what looked like veins running through a mountain, a network of tunnels or roots stretching deep underground. Next to it were more scribbled notes. Not rock. Tissue. They breathe. They feed. Another page had a map of Blackridge with certain areas circled in red, the places where Weaver had been studying before he disappeared. One of those circles was near where I'd found his notebook earlier today. I stared at the map for a long time before making up my mind. Whatever happened to Professor Weaver, and whatever was going on in these mountains, I had to find out. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It felt like something bigger than me, something dangerous. Max whined softly as I grabbed my backpack and started loading it with supplies. Water bottles, a flashlight, with extra batteries this time, some food, and my hunting knife. "You don't have to come," I said to him as I slung the pack over my shoulder. "But I'm guessing you're not going to let me go alone." He stood up immediately and wagged his tail once, not happily, but like he understood what we were about to do. The hike back into the forest felt different this time, heavier somehow. The wind had died down completely, leaving an eerie stillness that made every sound seem louder than it should be. We followed the map toward one of Weaver's circled locations, a spot near an old rock formation locals called the Spine. It's a jagged ridge that looks like a giant backbone sticking out of the ground. As we got closer, Max started acting strange again, sniffing at the air and whining softly like he could sense something I couldn't. And then we found it. The entrance to a cave hidden behind a cluster of twisted trees. It wasn't marked on any map I'd ever seen, but there it was, dark and yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. I hesitated at the entrance, shining my flashlight inside. The walls glistened faintly as if they were wet or alive. Max barked once sharply before stepping into the cave ahead of me. "Guess we're doing this," I said under my breath as I followed him inside. The air inside the cave was cold and damp, and it smelled faintly of earth and something metallic. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls that seemed to shimmer and pulse, almost like they were breathing. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Max stayed close to my side, his ears pinned back and his tail low. He didn't bark or growl this time. He just kept moving forward like he was being pulled by something he couldn't resist. I wanted to turn around and leave, but my legs kept moving too, like they had a mind of their own. The deeper we went into the cave, the stranger it became. The walls weren't just shimmering. They were covered in some kind of glowing moss or fungus that pulsed faintly with light. It reminded me of veins under skin, carrying blood through a body. Every few steps I'd hear a faint rumbling sound, coming from somewhere deep within the cave, like something huge was shifting far below. I kept my flashlight pointed straight ahead, trying not to look too closely at the walls. But then I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A figure, slumped against the wall up ahead. "Professor Weaver?" I called out hesitantly, my voice echoing through the cave. The figure didn't move. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Max growled softly but didn't stop me. When I finally reached the figure, I felt my stomach drop. It was Professor Weaver, or what was left of him. His body was partially fused into the wall of the cave, his skin stretched and twisted like it had been absorbed by whatever this place was. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice shaking. Max barked sharply, snapping me out of my shock. He was staring at something further down the cave, a faint glow coming from around a bend in the tunnel. I didn't want to go any further. Every instinct told me to turn around and run as fast as I could, but something about that glow drew me in, like it was calling to me. "Stay close," I said to Max as we moved toward the light. When we rounded the corner, I saw it, the source of the glow. The tunnel opened up into a massive chamber filled with strange bioluminescent growths that covered every surface. In. The center of the chamber was something that made my blood run cold, a pulsating mass of flesh and rock that seemed to be alive. It looked like part of the mountain itself had come to life, a grotesque mix of stone and organic tissue that throbbed, with every beat of its massive heart-like core. Veins ran through it like roots in soil, glowing faintly as they carried something through its body. I stared at it in horror, unable to move or speak. This wasn't just a cave, it was part of whatever this thing was. The mountain wasn't just alive, it was feeding. Suddenly, the rumbling sound grew louder and the ground beneath us shook violently. The pulsating mass seemed to react to our presence, its movements growing faster and more erratic. Max barked frantically, pulling at his leash as if he wanted to get as far away from this thing as possible. "We're leaving," I said quickly, turning back toward the tunnel we came from. But before we could take more than a few steps, the entrance to the chamber began to close, rock and flesh merging together like a living door sealing shut. "No," I shouted, running toward the closing gap. Max squeezed through just before it sealed completely, but I wasn't fast enough. The entrance closed behind him with a sickening squelch, trapping me inside with this thing. I pounded on the wall, with my fists shouting for Max even though I knew he couldn't hear me anymore. The rumbling grew louder again, and I turned around slowly to face the pulsating mass in the center of the chamber. It felt like it was watching me, even though it didn't have eyes or a face. Somehow, I knew it could see me, feel me. Want me? I stood frozen, staring at the pulsating mass in the center of the chamber. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the eerie glow of the veins running through the walls. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but it wasn't just fear. It was something else. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and I swear I could hear whispers coming from the walls. I had to get out of here. Somehow. I turned back to where the entrance had sealed shut and ran my hands over the surface. It was warm to the touch, too warm for rock, and it pulsed faintly under my fingers. It felt alive. I tried pushing, pulling, even hitting it with the butt of my flashlight, but it didn't budge. The rumbling sound grew louder behind me, and I turned around to see the mass in the center of the chamber moving, stretching out tendrils of flesh and rock toward me. They moved slowly at first, almost cautiously, but then they started speeding up. I scrambled backward, my mind racing. What was this thing? What did it want? And how was I supposed to fight something like this? My eyes darted around the chamber, searching for anything that could help me. That's when I noticed something strange. A cluster of metallic objects, embedded in one of the walls. They looked like old mining tools. Pickaxes, shovels, even a rusted canister marked explosives. I ran toward them, dodging the tendrils as they lashed out at me. One of them grazed my arm, and I felt a sharp burning sensation where it touched me. I didn't stop to look. I just kept moving. When I reached the wall, I grabbed one of the pickaxes and swung it at the tendrils that were closing in on me. The sharp edge cut through them easily, and they recoiled with a sickening squelch. But I knew it wouldn't hold them off for long. I turned my attention to the canister marked explosives. It was old, probably decades old, but it looked intact. I pried it loose from the wall and checked inside. There were a few sticks of dynamite left, along with some matches. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the dynamite and started preparing it. I hadn't used explosives since my training days as a ranger years ago, but I still remembered enough to know what to do. The tendrils were closing in again, faster this time. The mass in the center of the chamber seemed to be growing larger, its movements more frantic as if it could sense what I was doing. "Come on," I muttered under my breath as I lit the fuse on the dynamite. The sparks hissed loudly in the quiet chamber, and I knew I only had seconds before it went off. I threw the dynamite toward the pulsating mass and ran for cover behind one of the walls. The tendrils lashed out wildly as if trying to stop me, but they couldn't reach me in time. The explosion shook the entire chamber, sending chunks of rock and flesh flying in every direction. The rumbling sound grew deafening as the mass convulsed violently, its glowing veins flickering like dying lights. For a moment, everything went still, silent except for my own ragged breathing. And then, the walls started collapsing. I didn't have time to think. I just ran. The chamber was falling apart around me, chunks of rock crashing down as veins snapped like cords under tension. Somehow, part of the sealed entrance had cracked open during the explosion, and I squeezed through just as another section of ceiling came crashing down behind me. Max was waiting outside the cave entrance when I stumbled out into the night. He barked sharply when he saw me, but didn't come closer. His tail was tucked low like he could still sense danger nearby. The ground beneath us trembled one last time before going still. The rumbling stopped completely, leaving only silence behind. I collapsed onto my knees beside Max, gasping for air as he nuzzled against me gently. "We're okay," I whispered shakily, though I wasn't sure if that was true. The mountain seemed quiet now. Too quiet, but something told me this wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, whatever Weaver had discovered, it wasn't gone for good. Max and I sat there in the dark forest, the cave behind us silent now, as if it had never been alive at all. The explosion had done something, hurt it, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't gone. Not really. The mountain felt different now. Quieter, yes, but also heavier somehow, like it was holding its breath. I looked down at Max, who was still pressed close to my side. His fur was matted with dirt and his eyes were wide with fear. "We're okay," I said again, more to myself than to him. My voice sounded hollow in the stillness of the night. I pulled out my radio from my backpack and tried calling for help. "This is Ranger Donnelly," I said, my voice shaky but firm. "I need assistance near Black Ridge Cave. Possible structural collapse. Over." The radio crackled faintly, but there was no response. I tried again and again, but all I got was static. It was like the mountain itself was blocking the signal. "Figures," I muttered under my breath as I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started walking back toward the trailhead. Max stayed close to me, his ears twitching at every little sound in the forest. The hike back to my cabin felt longer than it should have. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the trees. But there was nothing. When we finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind us and collapsed onto the floor. Max curled up beside me, his head resting on my leg as if he could sense how shaken I was. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Professor Weaver's face fused into the wall of that cave, or felt the tendrils lashing out at me. In the darkness, the whispers were still there too, faint but persistent, like they were buried deep in my mind. The next morning, I drove into town to report what had happened. The sheriff listened to my story with a skeptical look on his face, nodding slowly. as I described the cave and what I'd found inside. "You're sure about this?" he asked when I finished. "Do you think I'd make something like this up?" I snapped, my frustration boiling over. He held up his hands defensively. "I'm just saying. It sounds unbelievable." "It's not," I said firmly. "You need to send a team up there to investigate." The sheriff promised he'd look into it, but I could tell he didn't believe me. And sure enough, when a team finally went up to Black Ridge Cave a few days later, they found nothing. No glowing veins, no pulsating mass of flesh and rock, just an ordinary cave with signs of a recent explosion. They chalked it up to stress or exhaustion. Said I must have imagined it after spending too much time alone in the woods. Even Max's behavior didn't convince them. They said he was just reacting to my fear. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't over. I lost my job as a ranger after that, officially because of reckless behavior, but really because no one wanted me around anymore. They thought I was crazy or dangerous or both. I moved out of town not long after that and started working odd jobs to make ends meet. But no matter where I went or what I did, Blackridge stayed with me, the whispers in my mind growing louder every time I closed my eyes. Sometimes at night, I dream about the cave, the glowing veins and pulsating mass calling out to me like it wants me back. And sometimes when I'm awake, I'll hear that rumbling sound again, faint but unmistakable, like it's coming from deep underground. I don't know what that thing is or why it let me go that night. But one thing's for sure, it's still out there, waiting, and someday it'll wake up again. My name is Elaine Moretti. I'm a park ranger and I've spent most of my life in the wilderness. People say it's peaceful out here, but they don't know what I've seen. The forest isn't always quiet. Sometimes it feels like it's alive, watching you, waiting for something. This summer has been strange. The drought has dried up almost everything. The rivers are barely flowing, the lake is shrinking, and even the animals seem restless. I've been having trouble sleeping lately. Every night I wake up drenched in sweat after dreaming about water, endless waves crashing over me, pulling me under. But I try not to think about it too much. It's probably just stress. Today was supposed to be normal. My new trainee, Dennis Hoffman, arrived at the ranger station early this morning. He's young, maybe 22, and eager to learn. He grew up near here and knows all the local legends about the area. "You ever hear about the lake spirits?" he asked me as we walked toward the water. I laughed a little. "Lake spirits? Sounds like campfire stories." Dennis shrugged. "Maybe, but my grandma used to say people disappeared around this lake during droughts. She said the spirits get angry when their home dries up. I didn't take him seriously. At first, people love telling ghost stories about places like this. It makes them feel connected to something bigger than themselves. But as we reached the lake, I felt a chill run down my spine. The water looked wrong. It wasn't just low. It was rippling in strange patterns even though there wasn't any wind. And there was mist rising from the surface even though it was hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. Dennis pointed toward the far end of the lake where some campers had set up their tents. "Should we check on them?" he asked. I nodded. "Let's go." As we walked along the shore, I noticed something odd floating in the shallow water. Translucent egg-like sacs attached to clusters of algae. They pulsed slightly as if they were alive. "What are those?" Dennis asked. "I don't know," I replied, kneeling down for a closer look. "They don't look like anything I've seen before." Dennis stepped back suddenly, his face pale. "Elaine, look at the water." I turned my head and froze. There were ripples forming in perfect circles around us, as if something invisible was moving beneath the surface. "Let's keep going," I said quickly. When we reached the camper's site, it was completely empty, but not in a normal way. Their tents were still standing. Their gear was scattered around as if they'd left in a hurry. but there was no sign of them anywhere. Dennis picked up a shoe lying near one of the tents and frowned. "Look at this," he said, holding it out to me. The sole of the shoe had claw marks on it, long, deep scratches that didn't look human. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at those marks. Something wasn't right here. Something was very wrong. Dennis and I stood there for a while, staring at the abandoned campsite. The silence around us felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Maybe the campers had wandered off or gotten scared by a bear. But those claw marks on the shoe? They didn't make sense. "We should call this in," Dennis said, his voice low. I nodded and reached for my radio. "Base, this is Elaine. We've got an abandoned campsite near the south shore of the lake. No sign of the campers. Over." There was a crackle of static, but no response. "Base, do you copy?" I tried again, but all I got was more static. Dennis frowned. "That's weird. The signal's usually fine out here." I glanced at him, trying to hide my unease. "Maybe it's just interference. Let's head back to the station and report this properly." As we started walking back along the lake, Dennis suddenly stopped. "Did you see that?" he whispered. "See what?" He pointed toward the water. "There. Someone was walking on it." I followed his gaze, but all I saw were ripples spreading across the surface. "Dennis, no one can walk on water." "I know what I saw," he insisted. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking slightly. I didn't want to scare him, or myself, so I tried to stay calm. "It's probably just a trick of the light," I said, though deep down I wasn't so sure. We kept moving, but something about the lake felt wrong. The mist was thicker now, swirling in strange patterns that didn't seem natural. Every so often, I thought I saw shapes in it. Tall, thin figures that disappeared as soon as I blinked. When we finally reached the ranger station, I felt a wave of relief, until Dennis pointed at the radio on my desk. "It's on," he said, quietly. Sure enough, the radio was crackling with static, but mixed in with it were faint voices. They were speaking in a language I didn't recognize, their words slow and rhythmic like a chant. "What is that?" Dennis asked. "I don't know," I admitted. My hands trembled as I turned the volume down. Maybe it's just interference from another channel. But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't true. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, or at least as uneventfully as it could after what we'd seen and heard. By evening, we decided to check on the lake one more time before calling it a night. As we walked back toward the shore, Dennis suddenly froze again. "Elaine, look," followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There were footprints in the sand leading from the water up into the trees, but they weren't normal footprints. They started out human but gradually changed into something else, something with long toes and sharp claws. We followed them cautiously into the woods until they stopped abruptly at a clearing. In the center of it was something that made my blood run cold. A circle of stones arranged around what looked like an old wooden mask carved with strange symbols. "What is this?" Dennis whispered. "I don't know," I replied honestly. But one thing was clear. Whatever was happening here wasn't natural. And it wasn't over yet. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints. The way they changed from human to something else. And that mask, it felt like it was staring at me, even though it didn't have eyes. Dennis wasn't doing much better. When I came downstairs in the morning, he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his coffee like it held answers. "You okay?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "I couldn't stop thinking about those voices on the radio. Did you hear them? They weren't speaking English." "I heard them," I admitted. "But let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe there's a logical explanation." Dennis didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. "What's the plan for today?" "We're going back to the lake," I said firmly. We need to figure out what's going on. The walk to the lake felt different this time. Heavier somehow, like the air was pressing down on us. The mist was thicker than ever, clinging to the ground like a blanket. And the water, it wasn't rippling anymore. It was perfectly still, like glass. Dennis crouched near the shore and pointed at something in the mud. Elaine. Look at this. I knelt beside him and saw what he was talking about. More footprints, but these ones were deeper, like whatever made them weight a lot more than a person. They're heading toward the woods, Dennis said. I hesitated. Every instinct I had told me not to follow them. But we couldn't just ignore this. Let's go, I said finally. We followed the trail into the trees, moving slowly and carefully. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of our footsteps. After about 20 minutes, we found something that stopped us in our tracks. A series of ancient carvings etched into the bark of a massive oak tree. They looked like pictographs, simple drawings that told a story. Dennis ran his fingers over one of them. These are old, really old. What do they mean? I asked. I'm not sure, he said. But look at this one. It shows people standing by a lake and then disappearing into it. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the carving. It couldn't be a coincidence, not after everything we'd seen. We decided to head back to the station and call someone who might know more about this. A local anthropologist named Dr. Lawrence Weber. He specialized in studying ancient cultures and legends, and Dennis said he'd worked near this area before. Dr. Weber arrived later that afternoon carrying a stack of books and papers. He was an older man with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. After we showed him pictures of the carvings and described what we'd seen so far, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. This area has always been surrounded by stories, he said finally. Legends about spirits tied to the water. Beings who live beneath the surface and only emerge during times of drought. Why droughts? Dennis asked. Dr. Weber shrugged. No one knows for sure. Some say they're angry when their home dries up. Others believe they're trying to reclaim what was once theirs. What do you mean? I asked. He leaned forward, slightly. Thousands of years ago, this entire region was underwater. A massive lake that stretched for miles in every direction. As the land rose and the water receded, these beings were forced deeper and deeper into hiding. I exchanged a nervous glance with Dennis. Are you saying these legends are real? Dr. Weber didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out an old journal from his bag and flipped through its pages until he found what he was looking for. A drawing of humanoid figures made entirely of water. These are called borrowers, he said quietly. They take faces, voices, even bodies. Dennis swallowed hard. Why? To survive, Dr. Weber replied simply. The room fell silent as his words sank in. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Dr. Weber had said. Borrowers, faces, voices, bodies. The words echoed in my mind like a warning I didn't fully understand yet. Dennis and I decided to stay up late and keep watch near the lake. Something was happening here. Something we couldn't explain, and we needed answers. We set up a small campfire near the shore and waited. The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around us like it had a mind of its own. The water was still perfectly calm, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance. But then, just as I was starting to think we'd wasted our time, Dennis grabbed my arm. "Elaine," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Look." I followed his gaze toward the lake, and my heart nearly stopped. At first I thought it was just the mist playing tricks on my eyes, but as I stared harder, I realized what I was seeing. figures rising from the water. They were tall and thin, their bodies shimmering like liquid glass. They had no faces, just smooth surfaces where eyes and mouths should have been. Dennis reached for his flashlight and aimed it at them, but the beam seemed to pass right through them without effect. "What are they?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. The figures didn't move toward us. They just stood there, watching, if you could call it that. But there was something about their presence that felt wrong, like they didn't belong here. Or maybe we didn't. Suddenly, one of them raised an arm and pointed toward us. The gesture was slow and deliberate, like it was trying to tell us something. Dennis took a step back. "Elaine, we need to go." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We turned and started walking quickly back toward the station. But before we'd gone more than a few steps, Dennis stopped again. "Wait," he said. "Do you hear that?" At first, I didn't know what he was talking about, but then I heard it too. Faint whispers coming from all around us. They weren't loud enough to make out words, but they sounded ancient, like voices from another time. The whispers grew louder as we hurried through the woods until they were almost deafening. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, they stopped. We reached the station out of breath and slammed the door shut behind us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there in silence, trying to process what we'd seen. "They're real," Dennis said finally. "The borrowers? They're real." I didn't want to believe it. But how could I deny what we'd just witnessed? Dr. Weber was still awake when we told him what had happened. He listened carefully, his expression grim. "This confirms what I've suspected for years," he said quietly. "The borrowers aren't just legends, they're remnants of an ancient world that existed long before ours." "Why are they here now?" I asked. Dr. Weber hesitated before answering. "I believe they're drawn to times of drought because it weakens the barrier between their world and ours." "What do they want?" Dennis asked. "To survive," Dr. Weber said again. "And if that means taking from us, they will." His words sent a chill down my spine. But before I could respond, something outside caught my attention. The mist was pressing against the windows now, thick and heavy like smoke. And within it, I could see shapes moving. They weren't just at the lake anymore. They were here. The shapes in the mist pressed closer to the windows, their outlines shifting and rippling like water poured into a mold. Dennis and I stood frozen, watching as they moved, slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. It felt like they were testing us, waiting for something. Dr. Weber's voice broke the silence. "Close the curtains, now." Dennis snapped out of his trance and rushed to pull the curtains shut. I followed his lead, my hands trembling as I yanked them over each window. But even with the mist hidden from view, I could feel it out there, pressing in on us like a rising tide. "What do we do?" Dennis asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Weber didn't answer right away. He was flipping through his journal, muttering to himself as he searched for something. "Dr. Weber," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's happening? How do we stop this?" He looked up at me, his face pale but determined. "The borrowers are trying to cross fully into our world. They're using the lake as a gateway, but they need something to anchor them here." "What kind of something?" Dennis asked. Dr. Weber hesitated before answering. "A person." The room went silent as his words sank in. "They're looking for someone to take," he continued, "someone they can use to complete their transformation." Dennis took a step back, shaking his head. "No way, we're not letting that happen." "We won't," I said firmly, "but we need a plan." Dr. Weber pointed to a map spread out on the table. "There's an old legend about a temple beneath the lake, a place where the borrowers were first bound to this world thousands of years ago. If we can find it, we might be able to stop them." "How?" I asked. There's a ritual, he explained. A way to seal the gateway and send them back. But it requires someone with a connection to them. I frowned. What kind of connection? Dr. Weber looked at me strangely for a moment before speaking. You. What? I said, my stomach twisting. He gestured toward my arm where my birthmark, a faint swirl that almost looked like water, was visible just below my sleeve. That mark, he said quietly. It's a symbol of their world. You're connected to them in ways you don't understand. I stared at him in disbelief, but before I could respond, there was a loud crash from outside. They're coming, Dennis whispered. The front door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Water began seeping under the doorframe, spreading across the floor in thin streams that moved unnaturally, like they had minds of their own. We have to go, Dr. Weber said urgently. Now. We grabbed what we could. Flashlights, ropes, anything that might be useful, and bolted out the back door into the night. The mist was everywhere now, swirling around us like a living thing. The shapes within it were clearer than ever. Tall, faceless figures that seemed to melt and reform with every step they took. Head for the lake, Dr. Weber shouted over the sound of rushing water that seemed to come from nowhere. We ran, as fast as we could, slipping and stumbling on the wet ground until we reached the shore. The lake was even lower than before, revealing jagged rocks and patches of mud. But in the center of it was something new, a dark opening that looked like the entrance to an ancient temple. That's it, Dr. Weber said breathlessly. That's where we need to go. Without hesitation, we waded into the water and made our way toward the temple. The cold seeped through my boots and into my skin, but I forced myself to keep moving. When we reached the entrance, Dr. Weber handed me a small pouch filled with herbs and stones. You'll need these for the ritual, he said quickly. Place them in the center of the temple and recite these words. He handed me a piece of paper with strange symbols written on it. What about you? I asked. We'll hold them off, he said firmly, nodding toward Dennis. I wanted to argue. I didn't want to leave them, but there was no time. Go! Dr. Weber shouted as one of the figures emerged from the mist and lunged toward us. I ran into the temple without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest as I descended into its dark depths. The air inside was thick and heavy, filled with an ancient energy that made my skin crawl. At the center of the chamber was a stone altar covered in carvings similar to those we'd seen in the woods. I placed the pouch on the altar and unfolded the paper Dr. Weber had given me. The symbols blurred together as tears filled my eyes. But I forced myself to focus and began reciting them aloud. As I spoke, the ground beneath me began to tremble, and a low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. Outside, I could hear shouting and splashing as Dennis and Dr. Weber fought off whatever was coming for us, but I couldn't stop now. The hum grew louder and louder until it was almost deafening, and then everything went still. For a moment, I thought, it had worked, but then I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down and saw water rising around me, faster than it should have been, and within it were dozens of faces staring up at me with empty eyes. They weren't going to let me finish, not without a fight. I froze as the water climbed higher, wrapping around my legs like icy hands. The faces within it stared at me, blank, hollow, and unrelenting. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped in my throat. The ritual wasn't finished yet. I had to keep going. I forced myself to focus on the paper in my hands and began reciting the words again. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, the symbols seemed to glow faintly as if they were coming alive. The water surged upward, pulling at me harder now, trying to drag me down. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, a sound like stone splitting, and the entire chamber shook violently. The faces in the water twisted and contorted. their hollow mouths opening in silent screams. I shouted the final word of the ritual, and everything went still. The water around me dropped instantly, leaving me standing in the center of the chamber, soaked and trembling. The faces were gone. The hum that had filled the air was gone. And for the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. I stumbled out of the temple and into the night. The mist was gone now, replaced by a clear sky filled with stars. Dennis and Dr. Weber were waiting for me near the shore, both of them soaked and exhausted but alive. "It worked," I said weakly. Dr. Weber nodded, his expression grim. "For now." "What do you mean?" Dennis asked. Dr. Weber sighed heavily. "The ritual sealed the gateway, but it didn't destroy it. The borrowers will return eventually." Dennis looked at me with wide eyes. "What do we do then?" Didn't have an answer, and neither did Dr. Weber. We made our way back to the station in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we arrived, Dennis turned to me with a strange look on his face. "I think I'm done here," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "This place, it's not safe anymore." I wanted to argue, to tell him that we'd figure it out together. But deep down, I knew he was right. Dennis left that night without saying much more, and Dr. Weber followed soon after. By morning, I was alone again, just like before. The lake returned to normal. Over the next few days, or at least it seemed normal on the surface. But every time I walked near it, I felt a strange pull, like it was calling to me. And then there were the whispers. They started faintly at first, just a soft murmur near water sources, but they grew louder as time went on. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes moving in my reflection, or heard voices when no one was around. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that everything was fine now, but deep down, I knew better. The borrowers weren't gone, not completely. They were waiting, watching, and someday they'd come back. As I sat by the lake one evening, staring into its depths, I thought about Dennis and Dr. Weber, and all the people who'd disappeared over the years. I opened my journal and wrote one final entry. "The borrowers will return someday, and when they do, we won't be ready." The mist began rising from the water again as I closed my journal and stood up to leave.